The narrow streets of 11th century Jerusalem buzzed with the constant flow of Christian pilgrims, their weathered faces bearing witness to months of arduous travel across hostile territories. Among the city's Muslim inhabitants, these foreign visitors represented both economic opportunity and potential disruption. For the pilgrims themselves, reaching the holy city marked the culmination of a spiritual journey that had tested their faith, drained their purses, and often broken their bodies. Many arrived sick, injured, or destitute, having fallen victim to bandits, disease, or the simple hardships of medieval travel. It was in this environment of desperate need that a group of Italian merchants from Amalfi recognized both a moral imperative and a practical necessity. Around 1048, these Amalfitan traders established the first iteration of what would become the Hospital of St. John, initially as a modest hospice dedicated to caring for Christian pilgrims. The merchants, who maintained regular commercial ties with Jerusalem through their Mediterranean trading networks, understood the precarious situation facing their fellow Christians. The original foundation operated under the authority of the Benedictine monastery of Santa Maria Latina, serving primarily as a charitable institution focused on providing basic medical care, food and shelter to those in need. The transformation of this humble hospice into something far more significant began with the arrival of Brother Gerard, a figure whose origins remain shrouded in historical uncertainty. Some sources suggest he was a native of Amalfi, while others propose he came from Provence or even from within the Holy Land itself. What remains clear is that Gerard possessed both administrative acumen and a deep commitment to serving the sick and poor. Under his leadership, the hospital began to expand its operations and develop a more sophisticated organizational structure. Gerard's approach to charitable work differed markedly from the traditional monastic model of his era. Rather than simply providing temporary relief, he sought to create a comprehensive system of care that addressed the full spectrum of pilgrim needs. The hospital's staff, initially composed of both clergy and lay people, developed specialized roles, some focused on medical treatment, others on food preparation and distribution, while still others managed the institution's growing financial resources and property holdings. This practical division of labour reflected Gerard's understanding that effective charity required systematic organisation rather than mere good intentions. The hospital's reputation for quality care spread rapidly throughout the Christian world, attracting both patients and benefactors. Wealthy pilgrims and local nobles began making substantial donations, providing the institution with landed property, monetary gifts, and legal privileges. These contributions allowed Gerard to expand the hospital's physical facilities, constructing additional wards, kitchens, and storage areas to accommodate the growing number of patients. The institution's success also attracted dedicated individuals who wished to devote their lives to serving the sick, gradually forming a community of brothers bound by shared purpose, if not yet by formal religious vows. The political landscape of 11th century Palestine provided both opportunities and challenges for Gerard's expanding operation. The Fatimid Caliphate's control over Jerusalem was increasingly tenuous, with various Muslim factions competing for influence while Byzantine and Western Christian interests pressed from the north and west. This instability created a complex environment in which religious institutions could sometimes negotiate favourable arrangements with multiple authorities, but it also meant that their security and privileges remained perpetually uncertain. Gerard demonstrated considerable diplomatic skill in navigating these treacherous waters. He maintained cordial relations with Jerusalem's Muslim authorities, while simultaneously cultivating support from Christian merchants, pilgrims, and clergy. This balancing act required careful attention to local sensitivities and a thorough understanding of the various political currents flowing through the region. The hospital's success in maintaining operations during this turbulent period testified to Gerard's political acumen as much as his charitable dedication. The arrival of the First Crusade in 1099 marked a watershed moment in the hospital's development. As Godfrey of Bouillon's forces approached Jerusalem, the city's inhabitants braced for siege and potential massacre. Gerard and his brothers faced a critical decision. They could attempt to maintain their neutral charitable stance, or they could openly support the Christian conquest of the city. The choice they made would fundamentally alter the institution's character and future trajectory. When the Crusaders finally breached Jerusalem's walls on July 15, 1099, the ensuing slaughter spared neither Muslim nor Jewish inhabitants. Amid this chaos, Gerard and his brothers provided aid to wounded Crusaders, demonstrating their commitment to the Christian cause while maintaining their primary mission of caring for the sick and injured. This decision proved strategically astute, as it immediately established the hospital's value to the new Crusader leadership while preserving its reputation for charitable work. The establishment of the Kingdom of Jerusalem under Godfrey of Bouillon, and subsequently under his brother Baldwin, created new opportunities for institutional development. The Crusader nobility, acutely aware of their precarious position in a hostile environment, recognized the value of organizations that could provide both charitable services and potential military support. Gerard quickly established relationships with key figures in the new kingdom, securing papal recognition and protection for his institution. Pope Paschal II's bull of 1113, Pi Postulatio Voluntatis, formally recognized the Hospital of St. John as an independent religious order, no longer subordinate to the Benedictine monastery of Santa Maria Latina. This papal recognition provided the brothers with unprecedented autonomy and protection, allowing them to develop their own rule and organizational structure without external interference. The bull also granted the order significant privileges, including exemption from local ecclesiastical authority and the right to elect their own master. Under this new legal framework, Gerard began formalizing the vows and obligations that bound the brothers together. Unlike traditional monastic orders that emphasized contemplation and withdrawal from worldly affairs, Gerard's rules stressed active service to the poor and sick. The brothers took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but these commitments were specifically oriented toward charitable work rather than purely spiritual pursuits. This practical focus reflected Gerard's conviction that true Christian virtue manifested itself through concrete acts of mercy, rather than abstract theological contemplation. The organizational structure that emerged during this period established patterns that would persist throughout the order's long history. At the head stood the master, initially Gerard himself, who held ultimate authority over all aspects of the institution's operations. Below him, a hierarchy of officers managed specific functions. The prior supervised religious observances and internal discipline, the treasurer handled financial matters, the hospitaller oversaw patient care, and the marshal coordinated security and logistics. This division of responsibilities allowed the order to manage increasingly complex operations while maintaining unified command and purpose. The brothers themselves came from diverse backgrounds, reflecting the order's practical approach to recruitment. While some were ordained clergy with theological training, others were lay people with medical knowledge, administrative skills, or military experience. This diversity created a unique institutional culture that valued competence and dedication over traditional markers of religious status. The order's willingness to accept both clerical and lay brothers, unusual for its time, demonstrated Gerard's recognition that effective charitable work required a broad range of skills and talents. The rule that governed the brothers' daily lives emphasized discipline, humility, and service. Each day began with communal prayer and continued with assigned duties that might include tending patients, preparing food, managing finances, or maintaining the hospital's physical facilities. The brothers ate simple meals, wore plain clothing, and lived in modest quarters, reflecting their vow of poverty. However, This austerity was balanced by the order's commitment to providing the best possible care for their patients, who often received food, bedding, and medical attention superior to what the brothers themselves enjoyed. As the Crusader states consolidated their control over the Levantine coast, the Hospital of St. John expanded its operations beyond Jerusalem. New foundations appeared in Antioch, Tripoli, and other major cities, each adapting the original model to local conditions and needs. These satellite institutions maintained communication with the mother house in Jerusalem, creating a network of charitable organizations that could coordinate their efforts and share resources when necessary. The gradual militarization of the order began as a practical response to the security challenges facing the Crusader states. While Gerard's original vision had focused purely on charitable work, the reality of life in a contested frontier region made military capability increasingly necessary. Muslim forces under leaders like Maudud of Mosul and Bursuk ibn Bursuk launched repeated attacks against Crusader territories, threatening not only the political survival of the Christian states, but also the safety of pilgrims and the charitable institutions that served them. The brothers found themselves compelled to defend their hospitals, their patients, and their own lives against these attacks. Initially, this defensive role involved little more than maintaining basic fortifications and coordinating with local military authorities. However, as the order's wealth and influence grew, so did expectations that it would contribute more actively to the common defence. Wealthy donors began providing the order with military equipment and trained horses, while the brothers themselves began acquiring the skills necessary for combat. This military evolution occurred gradually and without formal declaration. Individual brothers learned to handle weapons and armour, initially for defensive purposes but increasingly for active participation in military campaigns. The order's growing network of properties, many located in strategically important locations, naturally evolved into a chain of fortified positions that could support broader military operations. The brothers' vows of obedience and their disciplined communal life made them potentially valuable military assets, combining religious motivation with organizational cohesion. The transformation from purely charitable to military charitable organization reflected broader changes in the Crusader state's approach to survival and expansion. The initial conquest had relied heavily on temporary enthusiasm and divine providence, but long-term success required institutional structures capable of sustained effort over generations. Religious orders like the Hospital of St. John, with their permanent commitment and international support networks, offered solutions to problems that secular institutions struggled to address. By the end of the 11th century, the Hospital of St. John had evolved from a modest pilgrim hospice into a major religious order with significant political, economic, and military influence throughout the Crusader states. The brothers maintained their original commitment to caring for the sick and poor, but they had also begun developing capabilities that would eventually transform them into one of medieval Europe's most formidable military organizations. This dual character, charitable and martial, spiritual and practical, would define the order's identity for centuries to come, creating both opportunities and tensions that would shape its remarkable history. The death of Brother Gerard in 1120 marked the end of the hospital's purely charitable phase, though few at the time could have anticipated the dramatic transformation that would follow. His successor, Raymond Dupuy, assumed leadership of an organization that possessed substantial wealth, international connections, and a growing reputation for both medical expertise and administrative competence. Dupuy, a French nobleman with military experience from the First Crusade, brought to the position a strategic vision that would fundamentally reshape the order's identity and capabilities. Under Dupuy's leadership, the hospital began its formal evolution into a military order, though this transformation occurred through practical necessity rather than ideological choice. The Crusader states faced increasing pressure from Muslim forces who had begun coordinating their efforts more effectively under leaders like Il-Ghazi of Mardin and Balak ibn Bahram. These commanders understood that the Christian settlement's survival depended on maintaining secure communication lines between major cities and ensuring safe passage for pilgrims and merchants whose economic contributions sustained the Crusader economy. The militarization process began with Dupuy's establishment of formal military ranks within the order's hierarchy. The position of marshal, previously concerned primarily with logistics and supplies, expanded to encompass tactical planning and combat leadership. Brothers with military experience from their pre-monastic lives found themselves training newer recruits in weapons handling, horsemanship, and battlefield formations. The order's properties, particularly those located along major trade routes or near contested frontiers, began receiving systematic fortification improvements that transformed simple hospices into defensible strongholds. The distinctive appearance of hospital and knights emerged during this period as both practical necessity and symbolic statement. The black surcoat, worn over chainmail hauberks, provided several advantages beyond mere identification. The dark fabric absorbed less heat than lighter colours in the intense Middle Eastern sun, while its sombre appearance reinforced the order's religious character and distinguished it from the purely secular knightly orders. The white eight-pointed cross emblazoned on the chest carried deep symbolic meaning. Each point represented one of the 8 Beatitudes from Christ's Sermon on the Mount, while the cross itself proclaimed the brothers' commitment to Christian service and sacrifice. The military equipment adopted by Hospitaller Knights reflected contemporary European standards adapted to Eastern Mediterranean conditions. Their primary weapon remained the lance, typically measuring 12 to 14 feet in length and equipped with a steel point designed to penetrate both mail and the lighter armour favoured by Muslim cavalry. Secondary weapons included the arming sword, a straight double-edged blade approximately 3 feet long, and various polearms for dismounted combat. The knights' shields bore the order's distinctive cross and were constructed of wood covered with boiled leather, providing adequate protection while remaining light enough for extended combat. Hospitaller horses represented a crucial component of their military effectiveness. The order maintained extensive breeding programs that combined European destriers with local Arabian bloodlines, producing mounts that possessed both the size and strength necessary to carry armoured knights and the endurance required for extended campaigns in harsh climates. These horses, valued at substantial sums, received careful training that emphasized battlefield discipline and responsiveness to their riders' commands during the chaos of mounted combat. The Order's first major fortification project began in 1142 when they received Crac des Chevaliers from Raymond the Cid of Tripoli. This massive castle, perched on a strategic hilltop commanding the Hormuz Gap between the coastal mountains and the Syrian interior, required extensive renovation to meet Hospitaller standards. The brothers invested enormous resources in expanding the castle's defensive capabilities, constructing concentric walls, multiple towers, and sophisticated water management systems that could sustain a garrison of several hundred knights and sergeants during extended sieges. Crac des Chevaliers represented more than mere military architecture. It embodied the Hospitaller's approach to territorial defence and economic management. The castle's extensive outworks protected not only the garrison but also local Christian populations who could retreat within its walls during Muslim raids. The brothers developed the surrounding countryside through agricultural improvements, irrigation projects, and settlement programs that increased both the region's productivity and their own revenues. This integration of military, economic, and social functions became a hallmark of Hospitaller territorial administration. The construction techniques employed at Crac des Chevaliers demonstrated the Order's access to both European engineering knowledge and local building traditions. The massive walls, constructed of carefully fitted limestone blocks, incorporated advanced defensive features including machicolations, arrow loops positioned for overlapping fields of fire, and sally ports that allowed defenders to launch surprise attacks against besiegers. The castle's Great Hall, capable of accommodating several hundred diners, featured Gothic architectural elements that proclaimed the brothers' European origins, While incorporating practical adaptations to local climate conditions, Margat, acquired by the Hospitallers in 1186, represented their second major fortification project and demonstrated their growing expertise in castle design and construction. Located on a mountain peak overlooking the Mediterranean coast between Tortosa and Latakia, Margat commanded crucial sea routes while protecting Christian settlements in the region. The castle's position, nearly impregnable due to its elevation and the steep approaches on all sides, required different defensive strategies than Crac des Chevaliers, but served similar functions as both a military stronghold and administrative centre. The garrison life at these major hospitaller castles followed strict routines that balanced military readiness with religious observance. Nights began each day with communal prayer in the castle chapel, followed by weapons training, equipment maintenance and patrol duties. The brothers maintained their medical traditions by operating infirmaries within the castles that served both the garrison and local populations. These facilities, staffed by brothers with specialised medical knowledge, provided treatment for battle wounds, diseases and injuries common to medieval military life. The Hospitallers' military tactics evolved through constant warfare with Muslim forces who employed different strategies and equipment than their European counterparts. Muslim armies relied heavily on mounted archers who used composite bows to harass enemy formations from distance, avoiding direct melee combat whenever possible. This tactical approach challenged traditional European heavy cavalry charges that had proven effective in Western battlefields, but often failed against more mobile Eastern opponents. Hospitaller commanders developed counter-tactics that emphasized disciplined formations, coordinated movements, and careful timing of charges to maximize their impact. They learned to use crossbowmen and infantry to protect their heavy cavalry from archer harassment, while seeking opportunities to force decisive engagements where their superior armour and weapons could prove decisive. The brothers also adopted certain Muslim tactical innovations, including the use of mounted crossbowmen and the employment of Turco-Poles, local Christian cavalry, who fought in lighter armour using Eastern weapons and techniques. The Order's first major military test came during the Second Crusade, when Muslim forces under Nur ad-Din began systematic campaigns to recapture Crusader territories. Nur ad-Din, the Atabeg of Aleppo, and later Damascus, represented a new type of Muslim leader who combined military skill with political acumen and religious motivation. His forces employed sophisticated siege techniques, coordinated multi-front attacks, and propaganda campaigns designed to undermine Christian morale and unity. The Hospitallers participated in several major engagements against Nur ad-Din's forces, including the disastrous siege of Damascus in 1148, where poor coordination between Crusader armies led to humiliating defeat. However, they also achieved significant victories in smaller engagements where their discipline and tactical flexibility proved decisive. The brothers learned valuable lessons about the importance of intelligence gathering, logistical planning, and maintaining secure communication lines between their various strongholds. Throughout this period, the Hospitallers maintained their dual identity as both military order and charitable organisation. Their hospitals in Jerusalem, Antioch, and other major cities continued operating according to Gerard's original vision, providing medical care, food, and shelter to pilgrims and local populations. The Order's medical expertise, enhanced through contact with Islamic and Byzantine medical traditions, made their hospitals among the most advanced medical facilities in the medieval world. The brothers developed sophisticated understanding of surgical techniques, pharmaceutical preparations, and disease treatment that surpassed contemporary European medical knowledge. Their hospitals featured separate wards for different types of patients, specialised facilities for childbirth and surgery, and extensive pharmaceutical gardens where they cultivated medicinal plants from across the Mediterranean world. This medical expertise proved valuable not only for charitable purposes, but also for maintaining the health and combat effectiveness of their military forces. The financial resources required to maintain both extensive charitable operations and major military forces necessitated sophisticated economic management. The Hospitallers developed extensive property holdings throughout Europe that provided regular income through agricultural rents, commercial investments, and donations from wealthy benefactors. They established banking relationships with Italian merchants, managed international trade operations, and invested in various commercial enterprises that generated revenues to support their eastern operations. This economic network enabled the order to maintain military forces that included not only brother knights but also sergeants, Turcopoles, and mercenary troops hired for specific campaigns. The brothers developed detailed logistical systems for supplying their castles and field armies with food, weapons, armour, horses, and other necessities. These supply operations, coordinated across vast distances and often through hostile territory, represented remarkable organisational achievements that contributed significantly to Crusader military effectiveness. The rise of Saladin in the 1170s presented the Hospitallers with their greatest challenge since the Order's militarisation. Saladin, who had united Egypt and Syria under his rule, possessed both the resources and strategic vision necessary to mount sustained campaigns against the Crusader states. His forces combined the mobility and archery skills of traditional Muslim armies with improved siege techniques and disciplined infantry formations that could challenge European heavy cavalry in direct combat. The Hospitallers found themselves defending not only their own territories, but also serving as a crucial component of the Kingdom of Jerusalem's military forces. Their knights participated in numerous engagements against Saladin's advancing armies, including the crucial Battle of Montgisard in 1177, where a small Crusader force achieved a stunning victory against overwhelming odds. However, they also experienced serious defeats that demonstrated the growing effectiveness of Muslim military organisation and tactics. The Order's military evolution during this period reflected broader changes in medieval warfare, as commanders on both sides adapted to new weapons, tactics, and strategic challenges. The Hospitallers' transformation from charitable organisation to military order represented one of the most successful institutional adaptations of the Crusading era, creating an organisation capable of sustained military effort while maintaining its original humanitarian mission. This dual character would define the Order's identity throughout its long and remarkable history. The scorching July heat of 1187 shimmered across the barren hills near the village of Hattin, where the largest Crusader army ever assembled in the Holy Land faced annihilation. Among the parched ranks of Christian knights, the black surcoats of the Hospitallers stood out against the dusty landscape as their horses stamped restlessly, foam gathering around their bits. Master Roger de Moulins had positioned his knights on the right flank of the Christian formation, their 8-pointed crosses catching the harsh sunlight as Saladin's forces tightened their encirclement like a closing fist. The tactical situation had deteriorated beyond recovery. King Guy of Jerusalem's decision to march the entire royal army across waterless terrain in pursuit of Saladin had played directly into the Muslim commander's strategic trap. The Hospitallers, along with their Templar counterparts and the secular knights of the kingdom, found themselves trapped between the twin horns of an extinct volcano with no access to water and Muslim archers raining arrows down from the surrounding heights. The brothers' destriers, magnificent warhorses that had cost fortunes to breed and train, stood with their heads hanging low, their usual vigour sapped by thirst and exhaustion. Saladin's tactical brilliance manifested in his patient execution of a plan months in the making. His forces had systematically drawn the Crusader army away from their water sources, while maintaining constant harassment through mounted archery. The Muslim commander understood that European heavy cavalry, for all its devastating power in direct combat, became vulnerable when deprived of the logistical support necessary to maintain horses, equipment, and fighting men in peak condition. The Hospitallers, despite their superior discipline and training, could not overcome the fundamental reality that their military system required resources that Saladin had systematically denied them. When the final assault began, the Hospitallers fought with the desperate courage of men who understood the implications of defeat. Master Roger de Moulins led repeated charges against Muslim positions, his lance finding targets among Saladin's infantry before splintering against shields and armour. The brothers fought in tight formation, their training evident in the coordinated movements that kept their ranks intact even as individual knights fell to arrows, spears and curved swords. However, the horses stumbled on the rocky ground, weakened by dehydration and unable to maintain the momentum that made heavy cavalry charges effective. The collapse came suddenly when King Guy's tent, serving as the rally point for Christian resistance, finally fell to Muslim assault. The sight of the royal standard disappearing beneath a wave of enemy soldiers broke the morale of knights who had already endured hours of combat under impossible conditions. Master Roger de Moulins died in the final melee, his body found later among a circle of fallen Hospitaller knights who had made their last stand around their commander. The true cross, the most sacred relic of the Crusader states, disappeared into Muslim hands along with the kingdom's military leadership. The aftermath of Hattin proved even more devastating than the battle itself. Saladin's systematic conquest of Crusader strongholds proceeded with methodical efficiency as demoralised garrisons surrendered fortresses that might have withstood months of siege under different circumstances. The Hospitallers watched helplessly as their carefully constructed network of castles and hospitals fell one by one. Crac des Chevaliers, the Order's greatest fortress, held out longer than most, but even its massive walls and experienced garrison could not indefinitely resist the combination of military pressure and psychological warfare that Saladin employed. Jerusalem's fall in October 1187 struck at the heart of Hospitaller identity. The city where Brother Gerard had first established his modest hospice nearly 140 years earlier now witnessed the Order's complete evacuation. The Hospital of St. John, expanded and improved over generations of careful management, passed into Muslim hands as Saladin demonstrated the magnanimity that had made him legendary even among his enemies. The brothers who had served in Jerusalem's hospital found themselves refugees, their life's work abandoned as they joined the streams of Christian civilians, fleeing toward the remaining coastal strongholds. The Order's leadership, decimated at Hattin and during the subsequent sieges, faced the monumental task of rebuilding their organisation under the most adverse circumstances imaginable. The new master, Garnier de Nablus, assumed command of an order that had lost most of its knights, the majority of its territorial holdings, and its primary source of identity and purpose. The surviving brothers gathered in Tyre, Tripoli and Antioch, the last major Crusader cities still holding out against Saladin's advance, where they attempted to maintain their dual mission of military service and charitable work despite severely reduced resources. The arrival of the Third Crusade in 1189 provided the Hospitallers with their first opportunity to begin recovering from the catastrophe of Hattin. The massive expedition, led by the most powerful monarchs in Western Europe, brought not only military reinforcement but also financial resources and fresh recruits that enabled the Order to rebuild its combat capabilities. King Richard IV of England, Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, and King Philip II of France, each brought substantial forces and the political authority necessary to coordinate effective military operations against Saladin's consolidated empire. The Siege of Acre became the focal point of Crusader efforts to regain a foothold in the Holy Land. The Hospitallers participated actively in the gruelling 2-year siege, their engineers contributing expertise in siege warfare while their knights fought in the constant skirmishes and assaults that characterised the prolonged operation. The brothers established field hospitals within the Crusader camp, treating wounds inflicted by Muslim arrows, swords, and the diseases that ravaged medieval armies operating in unsanitary conditions far from home. Master Garnier de Nablus demonstrated the tactical flexibility that had always characterized Hospitaller military leadership by adapting the Order's fighting methods to the realities of siege warfare. Rather than relying solely on heavy cavalry charges, the brothers learned to fight effectively as dismounted infantry, using crossbows, polearms, and siege equipment to assault Acre's formidable fortifications. This tactical evolution reflected broader changes in medieval warfare as military engineers developed more sophisticated siege techniques and defensive systems. The fall of Acre in July 1191 marked the Third Crusade's greatest success and provided the Hospitallers with a new base of operations. The brothers immediately began establishing a hospital within the captured city, drawing on their accumulated medical knowledge to treat both military casualties and civilian populations. However, the Order's reduced circumstances meant that their Acre hospital, while competently managed, could not match the scale and sophistication of their former Jerusalem facility. King Richard's military campaigns along the Palestinian coast demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of Crusader military revival. The Hospitallers participated in the stunning victory at Arsuf in September 1191, where disciplined heavy cavalry charges shattered Saladin's field army and restored Christian confidence in their military capabilities. Master Garnier de Nablus led his knights in the decisive assault that broke Muslim resistance, their black surcoats and white crosses creating a distinctive formation that Muslim chroniclers remembered with grudging respect. However, the Third Crusade's ultimate failure to recapture Jerusalem highlighted the fundamental changes that had occurred in the strategic balance between Christian and Muslim forces. Saladin's consolidation of Egypt and Syria under unified command provided him with resources and strategic depth that individual Crusader states could not match. The Hospitallers recognized that their future lay not in grand campaigns of reconquest, but in the patient defense of remaining Christian territories and the maintenance of their charitable mission under increasingly difficult circumstances. The Order's adaptation to these new realities involved significant organizational changes that reflected their reduced territorial holdings and military capabilities. The brothers concentrated their remaining resources on defending the most strategically important positions, while gradually abandoning less defensible outposts. Crac de Chevalier remained in Hospitaller hands, its massive fortifications and strategic position making it too valuable to surrender without overwhelming force being brought against it. The development of new revenue sources became crucial for the Order's survival, as they lost the extensive landed properties that had previously supported their operations. The Hospitallers expanded their European holdings, establishing new commanderies in France, England, Spain, and other kingdoms where they could generate income through agricultural rents, commercial investments, and donations from wealthy patrons. These Western properties became the financial foundation that enabled the Order to maintain their Eastern operations despite territorial losses in the Holy Land. The Fourth Crusade's diversion to Constantinople in 1204 demonstrated the growing disconnect between Western European priorities and the actual needs of the remaining Crusader states. The Hospitallers, along with other Eastern military orders, found themselves increasingly isolated as European attention focused on other objectives. The brothers maintained their positions through careful diplomacy with local Muslim rulers, tactical alliances with other Christian forces, and the gradual development of a more defensive military strategy. Throughout the 13th century, the Hospitallers faced the constant challenge of maintaining military effectiveness while their strategic position continued to deteriorate. The rise of the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt under leaders like Baybars presented them with enemies who combined the military skills of their predecessors with superior resources and unwavering commitment to eliminating the remaining Christian presence in the Holy Land. Baybars understood siege warfare as well as any European engineer and possessed the patience necessary to reduce Crusader strongholds through systematic campaigns. The loss of Crac de Chevalier in 1271 marked a psychological turning point for the Order. The The great castle that had symbolised Hospitaller military power for over a century fell to Mamluk forces after a siege that demonstrated the futility of static defence against determined enemies with superior numbers and resources. The brothers who had garrisoned the castle fought with characteristic courage, but their resistance merely delayed the inevitable rather than preventing it. Master Hugh Revell's leadership during this period of gradual retreat demonstrated the Order's ability to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining their core identity and mission. Rather than engaging in futile gestures of defiance, Revell focused on preserving the Order's human resources and movable assets, while negotiating the most favourable terms possible for territories that could no longer be defended. This pragmatic approach enabled the Hospitallers to maintain organisational continuity during a period when less flexible institutions simply dissolved under pressure. The brothers' final decades in the Holy Land saw them concentrated primarily in Acre and a few other coastal strongholds where they maintained their hospital services while contributing to the common defence of the remaining Crusader territories. The Acre Hospital, rebuilt and expanded during the 13th century, became a symbol of the Order's enduring commitment to their charitable mission, despite the military disasters that had cost them so much of their territorial empire. The Siege of Acre in 1291 represented the final chapter of the Hospitallers' Holy Land experience. Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil's massive army, equipped with the most advanced siege engines of the era, systematically reduced the city's defences while the Christian garrison fought with the desperation of men who understood they were making their last stand. Master Jean de Villiers led the Hospitaller contingent in the final defence, his knights fighting from the walls and towers as Muslim siege engines battered the ancient fortifications into rubble. The fall of Acre on May 18th, 1291, marked the end of 2 centuries of Hospitaller presence in the Holy Land. The brothers who survived the final assault joined the general evacuation of Christian civilians and military personnel, abandoning the hospitals, churches and fortifications that had defined their identity since Brother Gerard's time. Master Jean de Villiers, wounded during the siege, sailed away from the Palestinian coast, knowing that an entire chapter of the Order's history had closed forever. The evacuation ships carried not only the surviving brothers, but also the accumulated treasures, relics and archives that represented the Order's institutional memory. These materials, carefully preserved during the chaos of evacuation, would provide the foundation for the Hospitallers' next phase of development, as they sought new territories where they could continue their dual mission of military service and charitable work. The loss of the Holy Land, devastating as it was, would prove to be not the end of the Order's story, but rather the beginning of a new and equally remarkable chapter. The Hospitaller galleys that limped into Limassol harbour in the summer of 1291 carried the remnants of an Order that had lost everything except its determination to survive. Master Jean de Villiers, still recovering from wounds sustained during Acre's final siege, stood on the deck of the lead vessel as Cyprus's limestone cliffs came into view. The island's familiar outline offered sanctuary, but it also represented an uncertain future for an organisation that had defined itself through 2 centuries of warfare and charitable work in the Holy Land. The brothers who disembarked at Limassol's bustling port carried with them salvaged treasures, sacred relics, and institutional archives, but they had lost the territorial foundation that had supported their operations since Brother Gerard's time. King Henry II of Cyprus welcomed the displaced Hospitallers with the calculated generosity of a monarch who understood both the Order's military value and the potential complications their presence might create. The Lusignan dynasty had ruled Cyprus since Guy de Lusignan's acquisition of the island from the Templars in 1192, and they had maintained careful relationships with the various military orders that used Cyprus as a staging ground for eastern operations. However, the arrival of the entire Hospitaller leadership, along with their surviving knights, sergeants and support personnel, presented challenges that went far beyond temporary hospitality. The immediate practical problems facing the order in Cyprus reflected their complete displacement from familiar territories and established routines. The brothers had lost not only their castles and hospitals, but also the extensive network of agricultural properties, commercial investments, and local relationships that had sustained their operations for generations. Master de Villiers found himself commanding an organisation that possessed substantial liquid assets salvaged from Acre, but lacked the territorial base necessary to generate ongoing revenue or maintain their traditional military and charitable activities. The establishment of temporary quarters in Limassol revealed the order's reduced circumstances while demonstrating their characteristic organisational efficiency. The brothers rented buildings throughout the city to house their personnel and equipment, transforming merchant warehouses into makeshift hospitals and converting residential compounds into administrative centres. The familiar sight of black surcoated knights moving through Limassol's narrow streets provided reassurance to local Christian populations, while serving notice to potential enemies that the Hospitallers remained a formidable military force despite their territorial losses. The Order's first major challenge in Cyprus involved redefining their institutional purpose without access to the Holy Land pilgrimage routes that had originally justified their existence. Brother Gerard's vision of caring for Christian pilgrims travelling to Jerusalem had provided clear direction for the Order's charitable activities, while the defence of Crusader territories had given military meaning to their martial evolution. Cyprus offered neither pilgrims in significant numbers nor frontiers requiring immediate defence, forcing the brothers to reconsider fundamental questions about their identity and mission. Master de Villiers addressed these challenges by emphasising the Order's commitment to fighting Islam wherever opportunities presented themselves, while maintaining their charitable obligations to Christian populations throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. The brothers established a hospital in Limassol that served both the local population and the constant stream of refugees fleeing Mamluk advances in Syria and Palestine. This facility, while smaller than their former Jerusalem hospital, demonstrated sophisticated medical knowledge accumulated over 2 centuries of treating battle wounds, diseases and injuries common to medieval military life. The financial management required to sustain operations in Cyprus without territorial revenues necessitated significant organisational reforms. The brothers developed more systematic approaches to managing their European properties, establishing regular communication with commanderies in France, England, Spain, and other kingdoms where they maintained substantial holdings. These Western estates, previously viewed primarily as sources of recruits and supplies for Eastern operations, now became the primary foundation for the Order's survival and future expansion. The administrative structure that emerged during the Cyprus period reflected both practical necessities and the Order's evolving international character. The development of the Long system, organising members according to their national origins, provided a framework for managing the diverse backgrounds and languages represented within the Order's ranks. The French langue, reflecting the Order's origins and the predominance of French nobles among its leadership, maintained precedence in ceremonial matters while sharing practical authority with the Italian, German, English, Spanish, Aragonese and Provençal langues. Each langue elected its own pilier, or chief officer, who represented their national group's interests while contributing specialised expertise to the Order's overall administration. The French pilier served as Grand Hospitaller, maintaining the Order's medical traditions and charitable activities. The Italian pilier held the position of Grand Admiral, reflecting Italian expertise in Mediterranean naval operations. The German pilier became Grand Bailiff, responsible for fortifications and engineering projects, while other piliers managed specific aspects of military organisation, logistics, and diplomatic relations. This national organisation system enabled the Hospitallers to harness the diverse skills and resources of their international membership, while maintaining unified command and purpose. Brothers from different langues brought varying military traditions, commercial connections, and political relationships that enhanced the order's overall capabilities. The system also provided mechanisms for resolving disputes and managing competition between national groups that might otherwise have fragmented the organisation during its period of displacement and uncertainty. The relationship between the Hospitallers and Cyprus's established nobility proved complex and occasionally tense, as both sides adjusted to new circumstances. The Cypriot aristocracy, composed primarily of French families who had accompanied the Lusignan dynasty's rise to power, viewed the military orders with a mixture of respect and suspicion. They appreciated the order's military expertise and international connections, but worried about the potential challenges that autonomous military organisations might pose to royal authority and established social hierarchies. King Henry II attempted to balance these competing interests by granting the Hospitallers specific privileges and properties while maintaining clear limits on their independent activities. The brothers received royal permission to establish their headquarters in Limassol and to conduct their traditional, charitable and religious activities throughout the kingdom. However, they were expected to coordinate their military operations with royal authorities and to acknowledge Cypriot's sovereignty over their activities within the kingdom's borders. These arrangements created ongoing friction as the Hospitallers sought to maintain the autonomous status they had enjoyed in the Crusader states, while adapting to the more centralised governmental structure that characterised the Kingdom of Cyprus. The brothers' international connections and substantial financial resources gave them influence that sometimes conflicted with royal policies, while their military capabilities represented both an asset and a potential threat to Cypriot security and stability. The order's naval activities became a particular source of tension as the brothers sought to maintain pressure on Muslim territories through seaborne raids and commercial warfare. The Hospitallers possessed considerable expertise in Mediterranean naval operations, accumulated through decades of coordinating supply shipments, troop movements, and communication between their various territories. Their galleys, equipped with the latest improvements in sail configuration, rowing arrangements, and armament, could challenge Muslim merchant vessels and coastal installations with considerable effectiveness. However, these naval operations created diplomatic complications for the Kingdom of Cyprus, which maintained complex relationships with various Muslim rulers and Italian commercial interests. Hospitaller attacks on Muslim shipping could provoke retaliatory raids against Cypriot territories, while interference with Italian merchant vessels risked economic consequences that the kingdom could ill afford. King Henry II found himself repeatedly mediating between Hospitaller military objectives and broader Cypriot political and economic interests. The brothers' efforts to establish new territorial holdings beyond Cyprus reflected their understanding that long-term survival required more than temporary sanctuary. Master de Villiers and his successors conducted systematic surveys of potential targets throughout the eastern Mediterranean, seeking territories that could provide both strategic value and economic resources sufficient to support renewed military operations. Their analysis focused on islands and coastal regions that offered defensible positions, access to maritime trade routes, and populations that might welcome Christian rule. The island of Rhodes emerged as the most promising candidate for Hospitaller expansion during their Cyprus exile. Located strategically at the intersection of major Mediterranean shipping routes, Rhodes possessed excellent harbours, fertile agricultural land, and a population that had experienced frequent changes of rulership without developing strong loyalties to any particular authority. The island's fortifications, while formidable, showed signs of neglect under Byzantine administration that suggested successful conquest might be achievable with adequate preparation and resources. The strategic analysis that led to the Rhodes decision demonstrated the sophisticated military and political thinking that had enabled the Hospitallers to survive 2 centuries of warfare in the Holy Land. The brothers understood that their future lay not in attempting to recreate their former territorial empire, but in establishing a more focused and defensible base of operations that could support their dual mission of military action against Islam and charitable service to Christian populations. The planning process for the Rhodes conquest involved detailed intelligence gathering, diplomatic preparation, and logistical coordination that drew on the Order's accumulated expertise in military operations. Brothers with knowledge of Rhodes's defences, political situation, and economic resources provided information that enabled Master Guillaume de Villaret, who had succeeded Jean de Villiers in 1296, to develop realistic operational plans. The Order's international network provided access to ships, supplies, and military personnel that would be essential for successful amphibious operations. The financial preparations for the Rhodes campaign required careful management of the Order's European revenues and the liquidation of assets that could not be transported or maintained during extended military operations. The brothers sold properties, called in debts, and negotiated loans that would provide the liquid capital necessary to equip and supply an expedition capable of conquering and holding a well-fortified island against potential counterattacks from various enemies. The recruitment of additional military personnel for the Rhodes campaign reflected the Order's evolved understanding of the diverse skills required for successful territorial conquest and administration. While brother knights remained the core of Hospitaller military strength, the expedition also included professional soldiers, naval specialists, engineers, administrators, and craftsmen whose expertise would be essential for establishing effective governance over conquered territories. This diverse force represented the Order's transformation from a primarily religious organization to a sophisticated military and political entity capable of independent territorial administration. The transformation of the Hospitallers from displaced refugees to sovereign rulers began with a calculated act of deception that would have profound consequences for the Eastern Mediterranean's political landscape. In the spring of 1306, Master Guillaume de Villaret dispatched a small advance force to Rhodes under the command of his nephew, Foulques de Villaret, with instructions that carefully concealed the Order's true intentions. The younger Villaret presented himself to the Byzantine authorities as a merchant seeking to establish trading relationships, while his companions conducted systematic reconnaissance of the island's defences, economic resources, and political situation. Rhodes in 1306 remained nominally under Byzantine control, though the empire's authority had weakened considerably since the Fourth Crusade's devastation of Constantinople a century earlier. The island's governor, appointed from distant Nicaea, commanded a garrison that had grown complacent through years of routine administration and infrequent challenges to imperial authority. The local Greek population, while Orthodox Christian, harboured no particular loyalty to Byzantine rule and had grown accustomed to the practical autonomy that distance from imperial centres provided. Italian merchants from Genoa and Venice maintained trading posts in Rhodes's harbours, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere that masked the Hospitallers' preparations. Foulques de Villaret's reconnaissance revealed both opportunities and challenges that would shape the coming campaign. Rhodes City, the island's primary settlement and administrative centre, occupied a naturally defensible position on the northern coast, where ancient harbours provided excellent anchorage for both commercial and military vessels. The city's walls, constructed during earlier periods of Byzantine prosperity, remained formidable obstacles that incorporated advanced defensive features, including towers positioned for overlapping fields of fire and gates designed to channel attackers into killing zones. However, the fortifications showed clear signs of neglect, with sections of wall requiring repair and defensive equipment that had not been properly maintained. The island's rural areas presented a different set of considerations for potential conquerors. Rhodes possessed fertile agricultural land that could support substantial populations, along with natural resources including timber suitable for shipbuilding and stone quarries that could provide materials for construction projects. The scattered villages and agricultural settlements that dotted the countryside were lightly defended, relying primarily on Rhodes City's garrison for protection against external threats. This distribution of population and resources suggested that successful conquest of the main city would effectively secure control over the entire island. The military intelligence gathered during this reconnaissance phase enabled Master Guillaume de Villaret to develop a comprehensive operational plan that addressed both the immediate challenges of conquest and the long-term requirements of territorial administration. The Master understood that the Hospitallers' future depended not merely on capturing Rhodes, but on establishing sustainable governance that could generate revenues, maintain defences, and support the Order's continued military operations against Islamic territories. The assembly of forces for the Rhodes campaign demonstrated the Order's remarkable ability to coordinate resources across vast distances and multiple political jurisdictions. Brother Knights arrived from commanderies throughout Western Europe, bringing with them not only their personal equipment and retinues, but also financial contributions that helped fund the expedition's substantial costs. The French Langue provided the largest contingent, reflecting both France's traditional prominence within the Order and the kingdom's continued commitment to Eastern military operations despite the loss of the Crusader states. The Italian Langue's contribution proved particularly valuable due to their expertise in Mediterranean naval operations and their commercial connections with merchants who could provide ships, supplies, and intelligence about regional political developments. Genoese and Pisan vessels, chartered through Italian Hospitaller connections, provided the transportation capacity necessary to move substantial military forces across the sea while maintaining adequate supplies for extended operations. These ships, equipped with the latest improvements in sail configuration and hull design, could carry both cavalry mounts and siege equipment essential for successful amphibious assault operations. The German and English Langues contributed specialised military expertise that reflected their members' backgrounds in Northern European warfare. German brothers brought knowledge of advanced siege techniques and engineering skills that would prove essential for both attacking fortified positions and subsequently improving defensive capabilities. English Hospitallers provided archery expertise and tactical knowledge gained through their kingdom's ongoing military campaigns in Wales, Scotland, and France, where new weapons and formations were constantly being tested and refined. The expedition's departure from Cyprus in the summer of 1306 marked the beginning of the Hospitallers' transformation from displaced refugees to territorial conquerors. The sight of Hospitaller galleys and chartered vessels leaving Limassol harbour, their black and white banners streaming in the Mediterranean wind, announced to the region's various rulers that the military order had recovered from the disasters of 1291 and was resuming active operations against its enemies. The fleet's size and evident preparation suggested capabilities that demanded serious attention from both potential allies and adversaries. The initial assault on Rhodes demonstrated the sophisticated amphibious warfare techniques that the Hospitallers had developed through decades of coordinating military operations across water barriers. Fulques de Villaret, now serving as field commander under his uncle's overall authority, directed landing operations that established secure beachheads while maintaining communication with the fleet and protecting the vulnerable process of disembarking horses, equipment, and supplies. The brothers' experience in combined arms operations, gained through countless engagements in the Holy Land, enabled them to coordinate cavalry, infantry, and naval elements with remarkable efficiency. The siege of Rhodes City began in August 1306 with systematic investment of the Byzantine fortifications. Hospitaller engineers, drawing on knowledge accumulated through 2 centuries of siege warfare, established positions that cut the city off from external support while beginning the methodical process of reducing its defensive capabilities. The brothers constructed siege engines including trebuchets and mangonels that could hurl heavy stones against the walls, while their crossbowmen maintained constant pressure on defenders attempting to repair damage or coordinate counterattacks. The Byzantine garrison's resistance, while determined, suffered from fundamental disadvantages that became apparent as the siege progressed. The defenders lacked adequate supplies for extended operations, having never anticipated facing a professional military force capable of maintaining systematic siege operations. Their equipment, poorly maintained during years of peaceful administration, proved inadequate for the demands of intensive combat against well-equipped attackers. Most critically, they could expect no relief from external sources, as the Byzantine Empire lacked both the naval capabilities and military resources necessary to mount effective assistance operations. The psychological aspects of the siege proved as important as its physical elements in determining the outcome. The Hospitallers' reputation for military competence and their obvious commitment to the operation convinced many defenders that resistance was ultimately futile. The brothers' disciplined behaviour and their willingness to negotiate reasonable surrender terms contrasted favourably with the harsh treatment that Byzantine territories had sometimes received from other conquerors, encouraging pragmatic accommodation rather than desperate resistance. The fall of Rhodes City in November 1306, after a siege lasting approximately 3 months, marked the beginning of Hospitaller territorial sovereignty that would endure for over 2 centuries. Fulques de Villeroi's entry into the conquered city demonstrated the order's intention to establish permanent governance rather than merely conducting a destructive raid. The brothers immediately began restoring civic order, protecting civilian populations, and organising the administrative structures necessary for effective territorial management. The establishment of Hospitaller rule in Rhodes required careful attention to the diverse religious and ethnic communities that comprised the island's population. The Greek Orthodox majority, while Christian, practiced religious traditions that differed significantly from the Latin Christianity that the brothers represented. The Hospitallers' approach to this challenge reflected their accumulated experience in governing diverse populations during their Holy Land period, where they had learned to balance religious conviction with practical necessities of territorial administration. Master Guillaume de Villeroi's death in 1307, shortly after the successful conquest, created a succession crisis that tested the order's institutional stability during this crucial transition period. The election of Fulques de Villeroy as the new master provided continuity of leadership while raising questions about nepotism and the concentration of power within particular families. However, Fulques' proven military competence and his intimate knowledge of Rhodes' situation made him the logical choice for consolidating the order's new territorial gains. The new master's first priority involved securing Rhodes against potential counterattacks from various enemies who might challenge Hospitaller control. The Byzantine Empire, despite its weakened condition, retained nominal claims to the island and might attempt to organise recovery operations. The Ottoman Turks, whose expanding power in Western Anatolia brought them into increasing contact with Aegean territories, represented a more immediate and dangerous threat to Christian control of strategic islands. Various Italian city-states and other Mediterranean powers might also view an independent Hospitaller state as either an opportunity or a threat to their own commercial and political interests. The fortification improvements that began immediately after the conquest reflected both immediate security needs and long-term strategic planning. Hospitaller engineers working with local craftsmen and imported specialists began systematic upgrades to Rhodes City's defensive capabilities. The ancient walls received extensive repairs and modifications that incorporated the latest developments in military architecture, including improved artillery positions and enhanced protection against siege engines. New towers, constructed according to advanced geometric principles, provided overlapping fields of fire that could devastate attacking forces while offering secure positions for defenders. The construction of the Palace of the Grand Masters represented both practical necessity and symbolic statement of the Order's sovereign status. Located within Rhodes City's fortified area, the palace complex served as administrative headquarters, ceremonial centre, and ultimate defensive position should the city's outer defences be breached. The building's architecture combined European Gothic elements with local Byzantine and Islamic influences, creating a distinctive style that reflected the Order's international character and their adaptation to eastern Mediterranean conditions. The palace's Great Hall could accommodate several hundred guests for ceremonial occasions, while its private chambers provided suitable quarters for the master and visiting dignitaries from European courts and other military orders. The complex included administrative offices where the order's growing bureaucracy managed territorial governance, financial operations, and diplomatic relations with various Mediterranean powers. Secure vaults within the palace stored the order's treasures, archives, and strategic reserves that would be essential for maintaining operations during emergencies or extended conflicts. The development of Rhodes's harbour facilities became a crucial element in establishing the island's role as a major Mediterranean naval power. The Hospitallers invested substantial resources in expanding and improving the ancient ports, constructing new quays, warehouses, and shipyards that could support both commercial operations and military activities. The Order's galleys, operating from these improved facilities, could patrol shipping routes, conduct raids against Muslim territories, and maintain communication with Hospitaller properties throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. The naval capabilities that emerged from Rhodes represented a fundamental shift in the Order's military strategy and operational focus. While the brothers maintained their traditional emphasis on heavy cavalry and land-based fortifications, they also developed sophisticated naval expertise that enabled them to project power across considerable distances. Hospitaller galleys, crewed by experienced mariners, and equipped with the latest improvements in naval weaponry, became feared throughout the eastern Mediterranean for their effectiveness in both military operations and commercial warfare against Muslim shipping. The economic foundation for this expanded military capability came from the systematic development of Rhodes's commercial potential. The island's strategic location at the intersection of major trade routes between Europe, Asia, and Africa provided opportunities for generating substantial revenues through port fees, customs duties, and commercial investments. The Hospitallers established trading relationships with merchants from various Italian city-states, while their own vessels carried goods between different Mediterranean markets and their European properties. The agricultural development of Rhodes's rural areas provided additional economic resources while ensuring adequate food supplies for the island's growing population. Hospitaller administrators introduced improved farming techniques, expanded irrigation systems, and encouraged the cultivation of crops that could be exported to generate additional revenues. The Order's experience in managing agricultural properties throughout Europe proved valuable in maximising the productivity of their new territorial holdings. The establishment of a sophisticated governmental structure in Rhodes demonstrated the Order's evolution from a primarily military organisation to a complex sovereign state. The Master retained ultimate authority over all aspects of governance, but the practical administration of territorial affairs required specialised officials with expertise in law, finance, diplomacy, and civil administration. The Lang system provided a framework for distributing these responsibilities among qualified individuals, while maintaining the Order's international character and preventing the dominance of any single national group. The judicial system that the Hospitallers established in Rhodes reflected their understanding that effective governance required more than military dominance. The brothers developed courts that addressed both civil and criminal matters, drawing on legal traditions from their European origins while adapting to local customs and the practical requirements of governing a diverse population. The Master's Court handled the most serious cases and disputes involving the Order's privileges, while lower courts managed routine civil matters, commercial disputes, and minor criminal offences. Greek Orthodox clergy retained jurisdiction over marriage, inheritance, and other matters traditionally governed by religious law, creating a parallel system that acknowledged the population's religious autonomy while maintaining overall Hospitaller authority. The transformation of Rhodes into a major naval power began with systematic improvements to the island's shipbuilding capabilities. Hospitaller administrators recognized that sustained naval operations required local construction and maintenance facilities rather than dependence on foreign shipyards that might become unavailable during conflicts. The brothers established shipyards in Rhodes's harbours that could construct galleys according to the latest Mediterranean designs, incorporating improvements in hull strength, sail configuration, and rowing arrangements that maximised both speed and combat effectiveness. These facilities employed skilled craftsmen recruited from Venice, Genoa, and other maritime centres, creating a knowledge base that enabled continuous innovation in naval technology. The galleys that emerged from Rhodes shipyards represented the cutting edge of 14th century naval warfare. These vessels, typically measuring 120 to 140 feet in length, carried crews of 150 to 200 men, including rowers, marines, and specialised personnel for operating the various weapon systems. The ships mounted bronze cannons in their bows and carried large complements of crossbowmen whose steel-tipped bolts could penetrate most contemporary armour at close range. Greek fire projectors, inherited from Byzantine naval traditions, provided additional offensive capabilities that proved particularly effective against wooden enemy vessels and coastal fortifications. The training regimen for Hospitaller naval personnel combined traditional seamanship with specialised combat techniques developed specifically for Mediterranean conditions. Rowers, recruited primarily from Rhodes and other Greek islands under Hospitaller control, learned to maintain precise timing during extended periods at sea while remaining capable of rapid acceleration during combat manoeuvres. Marines practiced boarding techniques, close-quarters combat with various weapons, and the coordination required for amphibious assault operations. Officers studied navigation, weather prediction, and the tactical principles that governed successful naval engagements in the confined waters of the Aegean Sea. The strategic deployment of this naval force reflected the Hospitallers' understanding of their position within the complex web of Mediterranean politics and commerce. Rhodes's location enabled their galleys to intercept shipping routes, connecting Constantinople with Alexandria, disrupting Muslim commercial activities while generating revenues through the capture of valuable cargoes. The brothers developed sophisticated intelligence networks that provided advance warning of merchant convoys, military expeditions, and political developments that might affect their operations. This information, gathered through a combination of paid informants, diplomatic contacts, and their own reconnaissance missions, enabled them to maximize the effectiveness of their limited naval resources. The first major test of Hospitaller naval capabilities came in 1317, when Ottoman forces attempted to establish permanent bases on islands near Rhodes. The Turkish commander, Umar Bey, had assembled a substantial fleet that threatened not only Hospitaller territories, but also the broader Christian presence in the Aegean. Master Helion de Villeneuve responded by deploying the Order's entire available naval force in a coordinated campaign that demonstrated their mastery of combined naval and amphibious warfare tactics. The engagement near Chios revealed the tactical innovations that Hospitaller commanders had developed through careful study of both Christian and Muslim naval traditions. Rather than relying solely on ramming attacks that had characterized earlier Mediterranean naval warfare, the brothers employed coordinated missile fire from multiple vessels to weaken enemy formations before closing for decisive melee combat. Their galleys operated in tight formations that maximized the effectiveness of their crossbow fire while providing mutual support against enemy boarding attempts. The battle's outcome, a decisive Hospitaller victory that scattered the Ottoman fleet and captured several enemy vessels, established the Order's reputation as the premier Christian naval force in the Eastern Mediterranean. The expansion of Hospitaller naval operations brought them into increasing conflict with Genoese and Venetian commercial interests that viewed the Order's activities as threats to their established trading privileges. The Italian city-states had invested enormous resources in developing Mediterranean commercial networks that generated substantial profits through carefully negotiated agreements with various Muslim rulers. Hospitaller attacks on Muslim shipping disrupted these arrangements while creating political complications that could jeopardize Italian commercial privileges in Egyptian and Syrian ports. The conflict with Genoa escalated in 1320 when Hospitaller galleys captured a Genoese merchant vessel carrying goods that the brothers claimed had been purchased from Muslim pirates. The Genoese authorities demanded the cargo's return and compensation for their losses, while the Hospitallers maintained their right to seize any goods that might ultimately benefit Muslim military capabilities. This dispute reflected broader tensions between religious and commercial motivations that characterized Mediterranean politics throughout the 14th century. The diplomatic negotiations that eventually resolved this conflict demonstrated the sophisticated political skills that Hospitaller leaders had developed through decades of managing relationships with various European and Mediterranean powers. Master de Villeneuve recognized that the order's long-term survival required accommodation with Italian commercial interests, while maintaining their commitment to warfare against Islam. The compromise agreement that emerged from these negotiations established protocols for distinguishing between legitimate commercial activities and transactions that directly supported Muslim military operations, creating a framework that reduced future conflicts while preserving the essential elements of both sides' interests. The relationship with Venice proved even more complex due to that republic's extensive commercial relationships with Muslim territories and their sophisticated diplomatic traditions that emphasized pragmatic accommodation over religious confrontation. Venetian merchants maintained trading posts throughout the eastern Mediterranean, including facilities in Alexandria, Constantinople, and various Syrian ports that generated enormous profits through the exchange of European manufactured goods for Eastern spices, silks, and other luxury products. These commercial relationships required Venice to maintain careful neutrality in conflicts between Christian and Muslim powers, creating inevitable tensions with the Hospitallers' militant anti-Islamic stance. The resolution of Venetian Hospitaller tensions required papal intervention and the negotiation of complex agreements that balanced religious, commercial, and political considerations. Pope John XXII's diplomatic efforts resulted in protocols that permitted Hospitaller naval operations against Muslim military targets while protecting Venetian commercial vessels and installations from attack. These agreements, while frequently tested by specific incidents and changing political circumstances, provided a framework for coexistence that enabled both parties to pursue their essential interests without constant warfare. The most serious military challenge facing the Hospitallers during this period came from the Mamluk Sultanate's systematic efforts to eliminate the remaining Christian presence in the eastern Mediterranean. Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad, who ruled Egypt and Syria from 1310 to 1341, possessed both the military resources and strategic vision necessary to mount sustained campaigns against Christian territories. His forces had already completed the conquest of the Crusader states and had begun extending Mamluk influence into Anatolia and the Aegean Islands. The 1444 Siege of Rhodes represented the culmination of Mamluk efforts to destroy Hospitaller power and eliminate their threat to Muslim shipping and coastal territories. Sultan Jakmak assembled a massive expedition that included over 180 vessels carrying approximately 18,000 troops, along with siege engines, supplies, and the specialized personnel required for complex amphibious operations. The Mamluk fleet, commanded by experienced admirals who had studied Hospitaller defensive capabilities, approached Rhodes with systematic plans for reducing the island's fortifications through coordinated land and sea attacks. Master Jean de Lastique's preparations for the anticipated siege reflected the defensive expertise that the Hospitallers had accumulated through decades of warfare in both the Holy Land and Rhodes. The brothers had spent years improving the island's fortifications, constructing additional walls, towers, and defensive positions that incorporated the latest developments in military engineering. The city's harbour was protected by massive chains that could prevent enemy vessels from entering, while the walls mounted artillery pieces that could engage attacking ships at considerable distances. The siege began in July 1444, with Mamluk forces establishing positions on the island's southern coast, while their fleet attempted to blockade Rhodes's harbours. The initial assault focused on the city's landward defences, where Mamluk engineers employed massive trebuchets and early cannon to breach the outer walls. Hospitaller defenders responded with their own artillery fire and coordinated sorties designed to disrupt enemy siege operations and inflict casualties on exposed attackers. The defence of Rhodes demonstrated the effectiveness of the improvements that the Hospitallers had made to medieval fortification design. The concentric wall system forced attackers to overcome multiple defensive lines, each protected by towers that provided overlapping fields of fire. The brothers had constructed underground passages that enabled defenders to move between different sections of the fortifications without exposure to enemy fire, while secure sally ports allowed for surprise attacks against besieging forces. Water cisterns and food storage facilities within the fortified area could sustain the garrison and civilian population for extended periods. The Mamluk assault on the harbour revealed the sophistication of Hospitaller naval defensive preparations. The brothers had positioned artillery batteries on both sides of the harbour entrance that could concentrate devastating fire on enemy vessels attempting to force passage. Underwater obstacles, including sharpened stakes and concealed rocks, created additional hazards for attacking ships while channeling them into predetermined killing zones. Hospitaller galleys, protected within the inner harbour, could emerge suddenly to attack enemy vessels that had been damaged or disorganised by the defensive preparations. The siege's turning point came in September, when a coordinated Hospitaller counterattack succeeded in destroying several Mamluk siege engines and inflicting heavy casualties on their operators. Mustard Elastic personally led a sortie that penetrated deep into enemy positions, his knights fighting with characteristic discipline despite overwhelming numerical disadvantage. The psychological impact of this successful attack, combined with the onset of autumn weather that made continued siege operations increasingly difficult, convinced the Mamluk commanders that their expedition had failed to achieve its objectives. The Mamluk withdrawal in October 1444 marked a decisive victory that enhanced the Hospitallers' reputation throughout Christian Europe while demonstrating their ability to defend their territories against the most formidable Muslim military forces. The successful defence attracted new recruits to the order and generated substantial financial contributions from European nobles who viewed the Hospitallers as the primary bulwark against Islamic expansion in the Eastern Mediterranean. The victory also established Rhodes as a symbol of Christian resistance that inspired defensive efforts in other threatened territories. The internal governance of Rhodes during this period reflected the Hospitallers' evolution from a primarily military organisation to a sophisticated sovereign state. The administration of the island required careful balance between the order's religious mission, their military obligations, and the practical necessities of governing a diverse population with different religious traditions, economic interests, and cultural backgrounds. The Greek Orthodox majority, while accepting Hospitaller rule, maintained their traditional religious practices and community structures under arrangements that acknowledged their autonomy in spiritual matters while ensuring their loyalty to the Christian cause. The treatment of Greek Orthodox subjects demonstrated the pragmatic approach that characterized Hospitaller governance throughout their territorial holdings. The brothers recognized that effective administration required accommodation with local traditions and the cooperation of established community leaders who possessed the knowledge and relationships necessary for maintaining civic order. Greek Orthodox clergy retained jurisdiction over marriage, inheritance, and other matters traditionally governed by religious law, while secular Greek leaders continued to manage local commercial activities and community affairs under overall Hospitaller supervision. The economic development of Rhodes under Hospitaller rule created prosperity that benefited both the ruling order and the local population. The brothers encouraged agricultural improvements that increased crop yields and expanded the cultivation of products that could be exported to European markets. The island's strategic location made it a natural centre for commercial activities that connected European, Asian, and African trade networks, generating substantial revenues through port fees, customs duties, and the Order's own commercial investments. The balance between military and charitable activities remained a central concern for Hospitaller leaders who sought to maintain their original mission while adapting to the realities of territorial sovereignty. The brothers continued operating hospitals in Rhodes City and other settlements throughout their territories, providing medical care that incorporated knowledge gained through centuries of treating battle wounds, diseases, and the various ailments common to medieval populations. These facilities served not only the Order's own personnel but also local civilians, pilgrims, and travellers who required medical attention. The medical expertise that the Hospitallers had developed represented one of their most valuable contributions to the territories under their control. Their physicians, trained through practical experience and access to medical texts from various traditions, could treat conditions that local practitioners found challenging or impossible to address. The Order's hospitals featured surgical facilities, pharmaceutical preparation areas, and specialised wards for different types of patients, creating medical centres that surpassed contemporary standards in most European territories. The thunderous roar of Ottoman cannons echoed across Rhodes Harbour on the morning of May 23, 1480, as Sultan Mehmed II's massive invasion fleet appeared on the horizon like a dark storm cloud spreading across the azure Mediterranean waters. Master Pierre d'Aubusson stood atop the palace of the Grand Masters, his weathered hands gripping the stone battlements as he surveyed the approaching armada through the morning haze. The sight that greeted him represented the culmination of Ottoman naval power. Over 160 vessels of various sizes, from massive galleys bristling with bronze cannons to swift galleots packed with Janissary troops, their red banners snapping in the sea breeze as they approached the island that had served as Christianity's eastern bastion for nearly 2 centuries. Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, had turned his attention to Rhodes after consolidating Ottoman control over the Balkans and establishing Turkish naval supremacy in the Black Sea. The Sultan understood that Hospitaller naval operations from Rhodes posed a constant threat to Ottoman commercial shipping and coastal territories, while the island's strategic position enabled Christian forces to coordinate with European powers seeking to challenge Turkish expansion. The elimination of the Knights Hospitaller had become essential to Ottoman plans for complete domination of the eastern Mediterranean. The Ottoman force that approached Rhodes in 1480 represented the most formidable military expedition ever assembled against the island. Mesih Pasha, the expedition's commander, had spent months preparing detailed plans that incorporated lessons learned from previous Turkish siege operations and intelligence gathered about Hospitaller defensive capabilities. The Turkish army included approximately 70,000 troops, elite Janissary infantry armed with firearms and traditional weapons, Sipahi cavalry equipped for both mounted combat and siege operations, specialised artillery crews trained in operating the massive cannons that had proven so effective against Constantinople's walls, and thousands of support personnel responsible for maintaining supplies and equipment during extended operations. The siege engines that accompanied this expedition demonstrated the advanced state of Ottoman military technology. Turkish foundries had produced cannons of unprecedented size, including several massive bombards capable of hurling stone projectiles weighing over 600 pounds against fortified walls. These weapons, transported aboard specially constructed vessels and requiring teams of oxen to move them into position, represented the cutting edge of 15th century siege warfare. Smaller cannons, more manoeuvrable but still devastatingly effective, could be positioned to provide sustained bombardment of specific defensive positions while remaining relatively protected from counter-battery fire. Master d'Aubusson's preparations for the anticipated siege reflected both his personal military experience and the collective defensive expertise that the Hospitallers had accumulated through decades of warfare. Born into French nobility around 1423, d'Aubusson had joined the order as a young man and had risen through its ranks by demonstrating exceptional competence in both military and administrative affairs. His election as master in 1476 had brought to the position a leader who combined strategic vision with the practical experience necessary for coordinating complex defensive operations. The fortifications that d'Aubusson commanded represented the culmination of nearly 2 centuries of continuous improvement and adaptation to changing military technologies. The walls of Rhodes City, originally constructed during the Byzantine period and systematically upgraded by successive Hospitaller administrations, incorporated the most advanced defensive features available to 15th century military engineers. The outer walls, measuring over 40 feet in height and 12 feet in thickness, were constructed of massive limestone blocks that could absorb tremendous punishment from artillery bombardment. Projecting towers, positioned at regular intervals along the wall's length, provided overlapping fields of fire that could devastate attacking forces while offering secure positions for defenders. The defensive preparations that d'Aubusson had implemented during his 4 years as master demonstrated his understanding of the evolving nature of siege warfare. The introduction of gunpowder artillery had fundamentally altered the balance between attackers and defenders, requiring new approaches to fortification design and defensive tactics. The master had overseen the construction of additional earthworks that could absorb cannon fire more effectively than stone walls, while new artillery positions within the fortifications enabled defenders to engage enemy batteries at extended ranges. The human resources available to d'Aubusson for the defence reflected both the Order's international character and the limitations imposed by their island location. The garrison included approximately 600 brother knights representing all the major langues, each bringing specialised skills and equipment from their respective European backgrounds. French knights, the largest single contingent, provided heavy cavalry capabilities and expertise in siege warfare gained through their kingdom's ongoing military campaigns. Italian brothers contributed naval expertise and knowledge of advanced artillery techniques developed in their homeland's competitive city-state environment. German and English knights brought specialised knowledge of crossbow tactics and defensive engineering that proved valuable in preparing for sustained siege operations. The civilian population of Rhodes, numbering approximately 7,000 inhabitants, represented both an asset and a responsibility for the defending garrison. The Greek Orthodox majority, while maintaining their distinct religious traditions, had developed genuine loyalty to Hospitaller rule through decades of fair governance and protection from external threats. These civilians possessed intimate knowledge of the island's geography, resources, and potential defensive positions that could prove invaluable during extended siege operations. However, their presence within the fortified city also created logistical challenges related to food distribution, medical care, and maintaining morale during what promised to be a prolonged and dangerous confrontation. The initial Ottoman assault began on July 28, 1480. With a coordinated bombardment from both land and sea positions that demonstrated the sophisticated tactical planning that had characterised Turkish military operations since Mehmed II's rise to power. The massive cannons positioned on the hills overlooking Rhodes City began a systematic bombardment designed to breach the outer walls and create practicable gaps for infantry assault. Simultaneously, Ottoman galleys positioned in the harbour launched their own artillery attacks against the seaward fortifications, attempting to divide the defenders' attention and prevent them from concentrating their forces against any single point of attack. The sound of the bombardment, audible for miles across the surrounding sea, created a continuous thunder that tested the nerves of both defenders and civilians sheltering within the city. The massive stone projectiles hurled by Ottoman cannons struck the walls with tremendous force, sending clouds of limestone dust and debris cascading into the streets below. The psychological impact of this constant bombardment, intended to weaken defender morale and encourage surrender, instead seemed to strengthen Hospitaller resolve, as the brothers and their supporters recognized that their survival depended on successful resistance. D'Aubuisson's response to the Ottoman bombardment demonstrated the defensive innovations that the Hospitallers had developed through their long experience with siege warfare. Rather than attempting to prevent all damage to the fortifications, the master focused on maintaining the walls' overall integrity while preparing secondary defensive positions that could continue resistance even if the outer walls were breached. Teams of civilian volunteers working under the direction of Hospitaller engineers laboured constantly to repair damage from artillery bombardment and to construct additional earthworks that could absorb future attacks. The first major Ottoman assault came on August 9th, following 2 weeks of intensive bombardment that had created several gaps in the outer walls. Janissary infantry, supported by Sipahi cavalry and various auxiliary troops, advanced against multiple points along the fortifications in a coordinated attack designed to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers and simultaneous pressure on different sections of the defensive perimeter. The assault began before dawn, with Turkish forces using the cover of darkness to approach the walls and position scaling ladders and other assault equipment. The Hospitaller defence of this first major assault revealed both their tactical expertise and the effectiveness of their defensive preparations. D'Aubusson had positioned his limited forces to maximise their effectiveness, concentrating brother knights at the most critical points while using civilian volunteers and auxiliary troops to defend secondary positions. The master himself fought in the thick of the combat, his distinctive armour and surcoat making him easily recognisable as he moved between different sections of the wall to coordinate the defence and encourage his followers. The hand-to-hand combat that characterised this assault demonstrated the brutal reality of medieval siege warfare. Hospitaller knights, fighting with swords, maces and polearms, engaged Turkish soldiers who had scaled the walls or penetrated through breached sections. The confined space atop the fortifications created a chaotic melee where individual skill and courage often determined survival. The brothers' superior armour and weapons provided significant advantages in close combat, while their disciplined training enabled them to maintain formation and mutual support even under extreme pressure. The repulse of this first assault, achieved after several hours of intense fighting, provided a crucial psychological victory for the defenders, while demonstrating to the Ottomans that Rhodes would not fall easily. Turkish casualties, estimated at over 2,000 dead and wounded, represented a significant loss for an expedition that had expected to achieve victory through rapid assault. The failure also revealed weaknesses in Ottoman siege tactics and coordination that D'Aubusson could exploit in preparing for future attacks. The siege settled into a pattern of constant bombardment, punctuated by periodic assaults as both sides adapted their tactics to the realities of the confrontation. Messier Pasha, recognising that direct assault had proven too costly, shifted to a strategy of systematic reduction that relied primarily on artillery bombardment to gradually weaken the fortifications and defender morale. This approach required enormous quantities of gunpowder and ammunition, straining Ottoman supply lines that stretched across hundreds of miles of hostile or contested territory. The logistical challenges facing the Ottoman expedition became increasingly apparent as the siege extended into autumn. The Turkish army required enormous daily quantities of food, water, ammunition, and other supplies that had to be transported by sea from distant bases in Anatolia and the Balkans. Hospitaller naval forces, operating from concealed bases on nearby islands, conducted constant raids against Ottoman supply convoys, sinking merchant vessels and capturing valuable cargoes that weakened the besieging army's capabilities. D'Aubuisson's coordination of these naval operations from within the besieged city demonstrated the sophisticated communication systems that the Hospitallers had developed throughout their island territories. Using signal fires, messenger pigeons, and small boats that could navigate between islands under cover of darkness, the master maintained contact with Hospitaller forces throughout the Aegean and coordinated their activities to maximize pressure on Ottoman supply lines. These operations, while individually small in scale, cumulatively created serious problems for Turkish commanders who found their resources constantly depleted by losses that they could not prevent or adequately replace. The climactic assault of the 1480 siege came on September 9th, when Messi Pasha committed his remaining reserves in a final attempt to capture Rhodes before winter weather made continued operations impossible. This attack, involving over 40,000 troops advancing simultaneously against multiple points along the fortifications, represented the largest single military operation ever conducted against the island. The assault began with an unprecedented artillery bombardment that continued for 6 hours, reducing sections of the outer wall to rubble and creating clouds of dust and smoke that obscured the battlefield. The fighting that followed tested both sides to their absolute limits. Turkish troops, advancing through the breached walls and over scaling ladders, encountered desperate resistance from defenders who understood that defeat meant not only their own destruction, but the end of Christian presence in the eastern Mediterranean. D'Aubuisson, wounded by an arrow that penetrated his armour, continued directing the defence while bleeding profusely, his personal example inspiring continued resistance when the situation appeared hopeless. The turning point came when a coordinated Hospitaller counterattack, led by the master himself despite his wounds, succeeded in recapturing a section of wall that Turkish forces had temporarily occupied. The sight of D'Aubuisson's banner flying once again over this crucial position encouraged the defenders, while demoralising Ottoman troops who had believed victory was within their grasp. The psychological impact of this reversal, combined with heavy casualties and the approach of winter weather, convinced Messi Pasha that continued siege operations were no longer feasible. The Ottoman withdrawal in October 1480 marked one of the most significant Christian victories of the 15th century and established D'Aubuisson's reputation as one of the era's greatest military commanders. The successful defence had cost the Turks an estimated 9,000 casualties and enormous quantities of equipment and supplies, while demonstrating that even the most powerful Muslim armies could be defeated by determined Christian resistance. The victory attracted new recruits and financial support from throughout Christian Europe, enabling the Hospitallers to begin immediate preparations for the inevitable Ottoman return. The 20-year period between the two great sieges witnessed systematic efforts by successive masters to strengthen Rhodes's defences and prepare for renewed Ottoman assault. D'Aubusson, elevated to cardinal by Pope Innocent VIII in recognition of his heroic defence, used his enhanced political status to secure increased support from European powers who recognised the strategic importance of maintaining Christian control over Rhodes. The master's diplomatic efforts resulted in substantial financial contributions, military equipment, and technical expertise that enabled comprehensive improvements to the island's fortifications. The reconstruction program that followed the 1480 siege incorporated lessons learned during the Ottoman assault and reflected advances in military engineering that had occurred throughout Europe during the late 15th century. The damaged sections of wall were rebuilt using improved techniques that could better withstand artillery bombardment, while new bastions were constructed according to the latest Italian designs that provided enhanced fields of fire and protection for defending artillery. The harbour defences received particular attention, with new chain barriers and artillery positions that could prevent enemy vessels from approaching the city's seaward approaches. The development of Rhodes's artillery capabilities during this period reflected the Hospitallers' recognition that successful defence against future Ottoman attacks would require effective counter-battery fire and the ability to engage enemy ships at extended ranges. The brothers established foundries within the city that could cast cannons according to the latest European designs, while recruiting experienced artillerymen from various European armies who could train hospitaller personnel in advanced gunnery techniques. These preparations transformed Rhodes from a primarily passive defensive position into an active artillery fortress, capable of projecting significant firepower against attacking forces. The death of Pierre d'Aubusson in 1503 marked the end of an era for the Hospitallers, and created succession challenges during a period when Ottoman power was reaching new heights under Sultan Bayezid II and his successor Selim I. The election of Emery d'Amboise as the new master provided continuity in defensive preparations, but the order faced increasing pressure from multiple directions as Ottoman expansion accelerated and European support became less reliable due to conflicts between Christian powers. The rise of Suleiman I to the Ottoman throne in 1520 brought to power a sultan who combined his grandfather Mehmed II's military genius with enhanced resources and more advanced military technology. Suleiman's early campaigns in Hungary and the Balkans demonstrated his ability to conduct complex military operations across vast distances while maintaining the logistical support necessary for sustained siege operations. His attention to Rhodes represented not merely a continuation of Ottoman expansion, but a personal challenge to prove himself worthy of his illustrious predecessors. The Ottoman expedition that assembled in 1522 dwarfed the forces that had attacked Rhodes 42 years earlier. Suleiman's army included over 100,000 troops supported by 400 vessels carrying siege equipment, supplies, and the specialised personnel required for complex amphibious operations. The Sultan had learned from Messi Pasha's failures, developing more sophisticated siege techniques and ensuring adequate logistical support for extended operations. The artillery train that accompanied this expedition included cannons larger and more numerous than any previously assembled, capable of reducing the strongest fortifications through sustained bombardment. Master Philippe Villiers de l'Isle Adam, elected in 1521, inherited command of an order that had used the intervening decades wisely, but still faced overwhelming odds. The Hospitaller garrison numbered approximately 700 brother knights supported by several thousand auxiliary troops and civilian volunteers, while the island's fortifications, despite continuous improvements, remained fundamentally vulnerable to the massive artillery bombardment that Suleiman could bring to bear. L'Isle Adam's strategic assessment recognised that successful defence would require not only military skill, but also diplomatic finesse to secure the most favourable terms possible should resistance prove futile. The final siege of Rhodes began on June 26, 1522, with an Ottoman landing that proceeded with methodical precision, reflecting Suleiman's careful planning and superior resources. Turkish forces established secure beachheads while their fleet blockaded the island's harbours, preventing any possibility of external assistance or evacuation. The siege operations that followed demonstrated the evolution of Ottoman military capabilities since 1480, incorporating improved artillery techniques, more sophisticated engineering approaches, and better coordination between different military branches. The systematic bombardment that began on July 28, 1522, surpassed anything previously witnessed in Mediterranean warfare. Suleiman's artillery batteries, positioned on carefully prepared earthworks surrounding Rhodes city, included cannons capable of hurling projectiles weighing over 800 pounds with devastating accuracy. The Sultan had brought master gunners from across the Ottoman Empire, including Hungarian specialists captured during recent Balkan campaigns who possessed intimate knowledge of European fortification design. These experts directed a bombardment that targeted specific structural weaknesses in the Hospitaller defences, concentrating fire on wall junctions, gate approaches, and tower foundations where maximum damage could be achieved. Master Lyle Adam coordinated the defence from a command post within the Palace of the Grand Masters, maintaining communication with different sections of the fortifications through an elaborate system of messengers and signal flags. The Master's daily routine began before dawn, with inspections of the walls, assessment of overnight damage, and coordination of repair efforts that continued despite constant artillery fire. Lyle Adam's leadership style differed markedly from his predecessor d'Aubusson's heroic personal example. Instead, he focused on systematic organisation and careful resource management that could sustain resistance over the extended period that this siege would clearly require. The technological disparity between the opposing forces became apparent within the first weeks of bombardment. Ottoman cannons, cast in advanced foundries using techniques perfected through decades of siege warfare, could maintain sustained fire rates that gradually pulverized even the strongest masonry. The Turkish artillery positions, protected by elaborate earthworks and positioned beyond effective range of Hospitaller counter-battery fire, operated with virtual impunity while systematically reducing the city's defensive capabilities. Each day brought visible progress as sections of wall crumbled under the relentless pounding, creating gaps that would eventually become practicable breaches for infantry assault. The Hospitaller response to this overwhelming artillery superiority demonstrated both their tactical adaptability and the limitations imposed by their isolated position. Brother knights and civilian volunteers worked continuously to repair damage, using rubble from destroyed buildings to fill gaps in the walls and constructing secondary defensive positions behind areas most vulnerable to bombardment. The defenders developed innovative techniques for absorbing cannon fire, including the use of wooden frameworks filled with earth and stones that could be quickly positioned to block breaches or reinforce weakened wall sections. The human cost of maintaining these defensive efforts became apparent as the siege progressed through the summer months. Hospitaller casualties mounted steadily from artillery fire, sniper attacks, and the constant physical demands of repair work conducted under enemy observation. The Order's medical facilities, established in secure areas within the city's interior, treated wounds inflicted by stone fragments, burns from Greek fire, and the various injuries associated with construction work performed under combat conditions. The brothers' accumulated medical expertise, developed through centuries of treating battle casualties, proved invaluable in maintaining the garrison's fighting effectiveness despite continuous losses. The civilian population of Rhodes faced particular hardships as the siege transformed their city into an active battlefield. Greek Orthodox families, along with smaller communities of Jews and Italian merchants, found themselves trapped within fortifications that were under constant bombardment. Lyle Adams' administration worked to maintain civilian morale through fair distribution of increasingly scarce food supplies, protection of non-combatants from military pressures, and the maintenance of religious services that provided psychological comfort during the crisis. The Master's recognition that civilian support was essential for successful defence led to policies that balanced military necessities with humanitarian concerns. The Ottoman assault strategy evolved throughout the siege as Suleiman's commanders adapted to Hospitaller defensive innovations and changing battlefield conditions. Rather than attempting the rapid breakthrough that had failed in 1480, Turkish forces concentrated on systematic reduction through sustained bombardment, combined with mining operations designed to undermine the foundations of key defensive positions. Ottoman engineers, many trained in the advanced siege techniques developed during recent European campaigns, excavated tunnels beneath the walls while preparing explosive charges that could create sudden, devastating breaches. The underground warfare that developed during the siege required specialised skills that both sides had acquired through previous military experience. Hospitaller countermining operations, directed by German brothers with expertise in military engineering, attempted to locate and destroy Turkish tunnels before they could reach their targets. The confined, dangerous work of underground combat created a parallel battlefield where small groups of soldiers fought desperate engagements in darkness, using swords, daggers, and improvised weapons in spaces too cramped for conventional military formations. The first major Ottoman assault came on September 4th, following intensive bombardment that had created several significant breaches in the outer walls. Janissary infantry, supported by auxiliary troops and engineers carrying scaling equipment, advanced against multiple points simultaneously in an attack designed to overwhelm the defenders through coordinated pressure. The assault began in pre-dawn darkness, with Turkish forces using the cover of night to approach the walls and position their equipment for maximum effectiveness. The fighting that erupted along the fortifications demonstrated the evolution of siege warfare tactics since the previous Ottoman attempt. Turkish soldiers, armed with improved firearms and protected by better armour, proved more effective in close combat than their predecessors 40 years earlier. The Janissaries' disciplined formations and coordinated use of firearms created significant challenges for Hospitaller defenders who found their traditional advantages in individual combat skills and superior armour partially negated by these tactical innovations. Lyle Adams' coordination of the defence revealed his understanding of the changed military environment and the need for adaptive tactics that could counter Ottoman innovations. The master positioned his limited forces to maximise their effectiveness, concentrating brother knights at critical points while using auxiliary troops and civilian volunteers to defend secondary positions. However, unlike d'Aubusson's dramatic personal leadership during the 1480 siege, Lyle Adam remained in his command post to maintain overall coordination and communication between different defensive sectors. The repulse of this first major assault cost both sides heavily, but demonstrated that roads would not fall through rapid attack. Ottoman casualties, while sustainable given their overwhelming numerical superiority, included experienced Janissary troops whose loss weakened the army's overall effectiveness. Hospitaller losses, though proportionally smaller, represented irreplaceable specialists whose death or incapacitation reduced the garrison's ability to maintain effective resistance over extended periods. The siege settled into a grinding war of attrition, as autumn weather made major assault operations increasingly difficult, while Ottoman artillery continued its systematic destruction of the city's defences. Suleiman's forces maintained constant pressure through sniper fire, limited probing attacks, and continued bombardment while preparing for a final assault that would come with improved weather conditions. The Sultan's personal presence with the besieging army ensured adequate supplies and reinforcements, while maintaining the morale necessary for sustained operations. The diplomatic dimension of the siege became increasingly important, as both sides recognised that military action alone might not determine the final outcome. Lyle Adam maintained communication with European powers through messengers who could occasionally penetrate the Ottoman blockade, seeking military assistance that never materialised in meaningful quantities. The master's correspondence with Pope Adrian VI, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and various European monarchs revealed the political complexities that prevented effective Christian cooperation against the Ottoman threat. The winter months brought temporary respite from major combat operations, while creating new challenges related to supply, shelter, and maintaining morale during the extended siege. Ottoman forces, better supplied and more numerous, could maintain adequate living conditions while continuing their systematic reduction of Hospitaller defensive capabilities. The defenders faced increasing shortages of food, ammunition, and medical supplies, while dealing with diseases and injuries that accumulated over months of continuous stress and combat. The final phase of the siege began in November 1522 with renewed Ottoman assaults that exploited the cumulative damage inflicted over months of bombardment and mining operations. Turkish forces had created multiple practicable breaches, while their underground operations had weakened foundations throughout the defensive perimeter. Suleiman's commanders coordinated these attacks with improved tactics that, reflected lessons learned from previous failures and the changed condition created by extended siege operations. The December 1522 assaults represented the most intensive fighting of the entire siege, as Ottoman forces committed their reserves in coordinated attacks designed to achieve final victory before winter weather made continued operations impossible. Janissary troops, supported by artillery fire and protected by extensive earthworks, advanced through the breached walls while maintaining disciplined formations despite fierce Hospitaller resistance. The fighting that ensued tested both sides to their absolute limits, as the outcome of 6 months of siege operations was decided through hand-to-hand combat in the ruins of Rhodes's ancient fortifications. Lyle Adams' recognition that continued resistance was no longer militarily feasible led to negotiations that demonstrated both his diplomatic skill and Suleiman's desire to conclude the siege with minimal additional casualties. The master's assessment of the military situation, confirmed by his senior commanders, indicated that the garrison could no longer maintain effective defence of the breached fortifications, while civilian casualties were mounting to unacceptable levels. The decision to seek terms reflected not cowardice but realistic evaluation of circumstances that made continued resistance futile rather than heroic. The surrender negotiations that concluded in late December 1522 produced terms that reflected both Suleiman's magnanimity and his recognition of Hospitaller military competence. The Sultan granted the surviving knights safe passage to any Christian territory of their choosing, along with their personal possessions, archives, and sacred relics. Civilian populations received guarantees of religious freedom and protection from reprisals, while those who wished to leave Rhodes could do so without persecution. These terms, remarkably generous by contemporary standards, reflected Ottoman confidence and Suleiman's desire to demonstrate the civilized character of his rule. The final evacuation of Rhodes on January 1st, 1523, marked the end of the Hospitallers' 213-year sovereignty over the island that had served as their primary base of operations since the loss of the Holy Land. Master Lyle Adam and approximately 180 surviving brother knights boarded ships provided by the Ottomans, carrying with them the accumulated treasures, relics, and institutional memory of their remarkable island state. The sight of Hospitaller galleys departing Rhodes Harbour, their distinctive banners flying despite military defeat, symbolised both the end of an era and the Order's determination to continue their mission in new territories. The transformation of Rhodes from Christian fortress to Ottoman naval base proceeded rapidly as Suleiman's administrators established Turkish governmental structures and military installations. The island's strategic position, which had enabled Hospitaller naval operations against Muslim shipping for over 2 centuries, now served Ottoman interests in controlling eastern Mediterranean trade routes and projecting Turkish power throughout the Aegean region. The fortifications that had protected Christian interests for generations were systematically modified to serve their new Muslim masters, while the hospitals and churches that had defined Hospitaller identity were converted to Islamic purposes or demolished entirely. The Hospitaller galleys that had once struck fear into Ottoman hearts now rode at anchor in Valletta's Grand Harbour with increasing frequency, their bronze cannons growing cold between voyages that became shorter and less frequent with each passing decade. By the middle of the 17th century, the strategic landscape that had defined the Order's purpose for over 5 centuries was undergoing fundamental transformation. The Ottoman Empire, while still formidable, had reached the limits of its expansion and was beginning to turn inward, focusing more on consolidating existing territories than on aggressive maritime campaigns that had once made Hospitaller naval operations essential to Christian defence. The Peace of Karlowitz in 1699 marked a decisive shift in European-Ottoman relations, establishing stable frontiers that reduced the constant military pressure that had characterised the previous 2 centuries. The Habsburg victories in Hungary and the Balkans, combined with Venetian successes in the Morea and Polish triumphs in Ukraine, demonstrated that Ottoman military superiority was no longer absolute. For the Hospitallers, these developments represented both relief from immediate existential threats and the gradual erosion of their primary justification for existence as Christianity's militant vanguard in the Mediterranean. Grandmaster Ramon Perelos y Rocaful, who assumed leadership in 1697, recognised these changing circumstances but struggled to adapt an organisation whose entire identity had been forged through centuries of warfare against Islam. The Grandmaster's attempts to maintain the Order's military relevance through continued naval operations against North African corsairs and occasional participation in European conflicts could not disguise the fundamental reality that the age of religious warfare was drawing to a close. The sophisticated military machine that the Hospitallers had developed over generations found itself increasingly without clear enemies or defined objectives. The internal structure of the order began showing signs of strain as the traditional balance between military necessity and religious devotion shifted toward purely ceremonial functions. The langues that had once provided essential military specialization now became primarily vehicles for distributing offices and revenues among European nobility, who viewed Hospitaller membership more as a mark of social distinction than as a calling to active service. Young knights arriving in Malta often possessed little interest in the rigorous military training that had characterized previous generations, preferring the comfortable lifestyle that the Order's accumulated wealth could provide. The corruption that gradually infected Hospitaller administration reflected broader European trends toward the secularization of religious institutions and the transformation of military orders into aristocratic clubs. The vow of poverty, once strictly enforced through communal living and shared resources, became increasingly meaningless as individual knights accumulated private wealth and maintained personal households that rivaled those of secular nobles. The requirement for proof of noble ancestry, originally intended to ensure military competence and social cohesion, evolved into an exclusionary system that prioritized genealogical purity over merit or dedication to the Order's mission. Financial management became increasingly problematic as the Order's European commanders faced challenges from changing economic conditions, political upheavals, and the gradual erosion of feudal privileges that had traditionally supported their operations. The French commanderies, which had historically provided the largest share of the Order's revenues, encountered mounting difficulties as royal taxation increased and traditional agricultural arrangements came under pressure from new commercial relationships. The English properties, seized by Henry VIII during the Reformation and only partially restored under Mary Tudor, never regained their former productivity, while German holdings suffered repeatedly from the devastation of the 30 Years' War and subsequent conflicts. The administrative burden of managing these scattered properties across multiple political jurisdictions created inefficiencies that consumed an increasing portion of available resources. Communication delays, currency fluctuations, and the complex legal arrangements required to maintain properties in different kingdoms made effective financial planning nearly impossible. Local administrators, often drawn from the same noble families that dominated the Longs, frequently prioritized their own interests over the Order's needs, leading to systematic underreporting of revenues and the diversion of funds to personal use. Malta's transformation from a fortress island to a commercial entrepot reflected both the Order's adaptation to changing circumstances and their growing dependence on non-military sources of income. The magnificent harbour facilities that had originally served primarily military purposes were expanded and improved to accommodate merchant vessels from throughout the Mediterranean. The Order's strategic position between Europe and North Africa, combined with their accumulated expertise in maritime operations, enabled them to develop profitable relationships with trading companies that required secure ports and reliable services for their commercial activities. The construction projects that characterized 18th century Malta demonstrated both the order's continued wealth and their shift away from purely military considerations. The new auberges built for each langue during this period emphasised comfort and elegance rather than defensibility, featuring elaborate Baroque decorations and spacious living quarters that reflected their inhabitants' aristocratic expectations. The renovation of the Palace of the Grand Masters incorporated artistic elements and luxury furnishings that would have scandalised earlier generations of knights who had lived in Spartan conditions while preparing for constant warfare. The cultural life that developed in 18th century Malta attracted European intellectuals, artists and travellers who viewed the island as an exotic destination where Eastern and Western influences created unique artistic and architectural traditions. The Order's library, expanded through systematic acquisitions and donations from European scholars, became one of the Mediterranean's most important repositories of manuscripts and books, covering subjects ranging from military engineering to natural philosophy. The hospitals that the Hospitallers continued to operate incorporated medical knowledge from various European traditions while maintaining their reputation for providing care that surpassed contemporary standards in most territories. However, this cultural flowering occurred alongside the gradual erosion of the military discipline and religious commitment that had originally defined Hospitaller identity. The daily routines that had once balanced prayer, military training and charitable work gave way to more leisurely schedules that emphasised social activities and personal pursuits. The common meals that had reinforced communal bonds were replaced by private dining arrangements that reflected individual wealth and social preferences. The simple black habits that had symbolised the knight's religious vows were supplemented by elaborate civilian clothing that proclaimed their aristocratic status and personal taste. The intellectual currents of the Enlightenment posed particularly serious challenges to an organisation whose legitimacy depended on medieval concepts of religious warfare and feudal obligation. Voltaire's critiques of religious fanaticism and institutional privilege found receptive audiences among educated Europeans who questioned the continued relevance of military orders that consumed substantial resources while contributing little to social progress or economic development. The philosophical emphasis on reason, natural rights, and social utility provided frameworks for analysing institutions like the Hospitallers that seemed increasingly anachronistic in an age of scientific advancement and political reform. The economic theories developed by physiocrats and early political economists challenged the feudal arrangements that supported the order's European properties, while questioning the social value of maintaining large numbers of individuals in unproductive religious or military roles. Adam Smith's analysis of wealth creation and resource allocation suggested that the capital tied up in hospitaller properties and the human resources devoted to their ceremonial functions could be more effectively employed in productive economic activities that would benefit broader populations rather than supporting a privileged military caste. The political philosophy of the Enlightenment, with its emphasis on popular sovereignty, representative government, and individual rights, undermined the theoretical foundations of institutions like the Hospitallers that derived their authority from papal grants and royal privileges rather than popular consent. The concept of natural rights, as developed by John Locke and other political theorists, provided intellectual justification for challenging traditional privileges and redistributing resources according to principles of social utility rather than historical precedent. These intellectual challenges coincided with practical political developments that threatened the order's European properties and revenues. The Habsburg reforms in Austria and the Spanish dominions included systematic reviews of religious institutions and their social contributions, leading to the suppression of monasteries and military orders that were deemed unproductive or excessive. The Bourbon monarchs in France and Spain implemented similar policies that reduced clerical privileges and redirected ecclesiastical revenues towards state purposes, creating precedents that other European rulers were likely to follow. The French Revolution's assault on feudal privileges and religious institutions represented the culmination of Enlightenment critiques and provided practical demonstrations of how traditional arrangements could be rapidly dismantled. The civil constitution of the clergy and the subsequent suppression of religious orders eliminated many institutions that had existed for centuries, while the confiscation of church lands provided resources for financing revolutionary governments and satisfying popular demands for economic reform. These developments created models that other European movements could adapt to their own circumstances, while demonstrating the vulnerability of institutions that depended on traditional legitimacy rather than popular support. Grandmaster Emmanuel de Rohan-Polduc, elected in 1775, attempted to address these mounting challenges through a combination of internal reforms and diplomatic initiatives designed to secure the order's position within the changing European political system. De Rohan's administrative reforms included efforts to improve financial management, reduce corruption, and restore some measure of military discipline among the knights. However, these initiatives faced resistance from entrenched interests within the Langue and proved insufficient to address the fundamental problems created by the order's anachronistic structure and mission. The Grandmaster's diplomatic efforts focused on cultivating relationships with European monarchs who might provide protection against revolutionary movements and guarantee the order's continued existence. De Rohan's correspondence with Louis XVI of France, Catherine the Great of Russia, and other rulers emphasized the order's potential value as a stabilizing force in the Mediterranean and their commitment to supporting legitimate authority against revolutionary challenges. These appeals achieved limited success, as most European governments were preoccupied with their own domestic problems and viewed the Hospitallers as a minor consideration in their broader strategic calculations. The outbreak of the French Revolutionary Wars in 1792 created immediate threats to the order's French properties, while demonstrating the fragility of the traditional European political system that had supported their operations. The revolutionary government's systematic assault on feudal privileges and religious institutions eliminated the legal foundations that had protected Hospitaller properties for centuries. The confiscation of French commanderies deprived the order of revenues that had historically provided approximately 40% of their total income, creating financial crises that forced reductions in military expenditures and charitable activities. The impact of these financial losses was compounded by similar developments in other European territories where revolutionary movements or reform-minded governments challenged traditional arrangements. The Austrian Netherlands, several German states, and parts of Italy experienced political upheavals that threatened Hospitaller properties and disrupted the administrative systems that had managed these holdings for generations. The order's attempts to maintain their European network through diplomatic negotiations and legal challenges proved largely ineffective against governments that possessed both the political will and military power to implement radical reforms. The deterioration of the order's military capabilities became apparent as financial constraints forced reductions in naval operations and the maintenance of defensive installations. The galleys that had once patrolled the Mediterranean with regularity were increasingly confined to harbour due to the costs of manning and supplying them for extended voyages. The fortifications of Malta, while still formidable, received minimal maintenance as resources were diverted to more immediate needs or consumed by administrative expenses that had grown disproportionately large. The recruitment of new knights declined significantly as European noble families faced their own financial difficulties, and as military service in traditional religious orders became less attractive compared to careers in national armies or civilian occupations. The Langues struggled to maintain their traditional quotas of active members, while the quality of recruits often fell short of historical standards. Many young men who did join the order viewed their membership as a temporary arrangement that could provide social connections and financial benefits, rather than a permanent commitment to military and religious service. Grandmaster Ferdinand von Hompesch zu Bolheim, elected in 1797, inherited an organisation that retained the external trappings of its former greatness, while lacking the substance that had once made it a formidable military and political force. Von Hompesch, a German knight with limited experience in Mediterranean affairs, proved inadequate to the enormous challenges facing the order during one of the most turbulent periods in European history. His attempts to navigate between conflicting pressures from various European powers, while maintaining the order's neutrality and independence, demonstrated both the complexity of the situation and his personal limitations as a leader. The emergence of Napoleon Bonaparte as the dominant figure in French politics and military affairs created new threats that the weakened order was poorly equipped to address. Napoleon's strategic vision included the transformation of the Mediterranean into a French sphere of influence, with French control over key islands and coastal positions that could support naval operations and commercial activities. Malta's strategic position and excellent harbours made it an obvious target for French expansion, while the Hospitallers' weakened condition made them vulnerable to the kind of rapid military action that had characterised Napoleon's earlier campaigns. The French expedition to Egypt in 1798 provided both the pretext and the opportunity for Napoleon to seize Malta, while pursuing his broader strategic objectives in the eastern Mediterranean. The general's analysis of the order's military capabilities, based on intelligence gathered through diplomatic contacts and commercial relationships, revealed the extent to which Hospitaller power had declined since the heroic defence of the island against Ottoman forces 2.5 centuries earlier. The garrison that had once withstood the full might of Suleiman's army now consisted of fewer than 300 knights, many of whom were elderly or infirm, supported by a militia force of questionable loyalty and limited military value. Napoleon's approach to Malta combined diplomatic pressure with the implicit threat of overwhelming military force, creating conditions that made effective resistance virtually impossible. The French fleet that appeared off Valletta in June 1798 included over 300 vessels carrying approximately 40,000 troops, along with the artillery and siege equipment necessary to reduce any fortifications that might oppose their landing. This massive force, assembled for the Egyptian campaign, represented military capabilities that exceeded anything the Hospitallers could hope to resist with their depleted resources and obsolete defensive arrangements. The negotiations that preceded the French occupation revealed both Napoleon's diplomatic skill and von Hompesch's recognition that military resistance would be futile and destructive. The Grand Master's attempts to maintain the order's neutrality while providing limited assistance to the French expedition reflected his understanding that accommodation offered the only realistic hope for preserving some measure of institutional continuity. However, Napoleon's demands gradually escalated from simple hospitality and supply privileges to effective control over the island's military and administrative functions. The final surrender of Malta on June 12, 1798, occurred with minimal violence but marked the effective end of the Hospitallers' existence as a sovereign military order. Von Hompesch's agreement to French occupation in exchange for territorial compensation elsewhere demonstrated both the order's desperate circumstances and Napoleon's ability to exploit institutional weaknesses for his strategic advantage. The sight of French tricolour flags replacing the distinctive white cross of the Hospitallers on Malta's ancient fortifications symbolised not merely a change of government, but the conclusion of a remarkable historical epoch that had endured for 7 centuries. The dissolution of the order's governmental structure proceeded rapidly as French administrators implemented revolutionary principles that eliminated feudal privileges and religious autonomy. The knights who remained on the island faced choices between accepting French authority, seeking refuge in territories still controlled by traditional monarchies, or attempting to maintain some form of institutional continuity in exile. The majority chose exile, joining von Hompesch in a peripatetic existence that would continue for decades as European political upheavals prevented the establishment of any permanent base of operations. The dispersion of the order's accumulated treasures, archives, and artistic collections represented the final dissolution of institutional resources that had been gathered over centuries of military success and careful administration. Napoleon's systematic looting of Malta's churches, palaces and public buildings provided immediate financial resources for his Egyptian campaign, while destroying cultural artefacts that had documented the order's remarkable history. The loss of these materials, combined with the scattering of surviving members across multiple countries, made any future reconstruction of the order's institutional memory extremely difficult. The scattered remnants of the Knights Hospitaller who fled Malta in 1798 faced a crisis of identity that threatened to extinguish an institution that had survived the fall of Jerusalem, the loss of Rhodes, and countless military disasters over 7 centuries. Grandmaster Ferdinand von Hompesch, carrying the order's most precious relics and what remained of their archives, wandered between European courts seeking sanctuary and recognition from monarchs who were themselves struggling against the revolutionary tide sweeping across the continent. The traditional diplomatic relationships that had once guaranteed Hospitaller privileges and properties had dissolved along with the feudal system that had sustained them, leaving the surviving knights as anachronistic refugees in a rapidly modernizing world. The initial years of exile reveal the extent to which the order's identity had become intertwined with territorial sovereignty and military function. Without Malta's fortifications to defend or Mediterranean shipping lanes to patrol, the surviving knights struggled to define their purpose and maintain the institutional cohesion that had enabled their predecessors to recover from previous disasters. Many members simply returned to their family estates in various European countries, abandoning their vows and allowing their connection to the order to lapse into historical curiosity. Others maintained nominal allegiance while pursuing secular careers in national armies or civilian professions that offered more concrete opportunities for advancement and financial security. Von Hompesch's death in 1805 precipitated a succession crisis that reflected the order's desperate circumstances and the competing visions that different factions held for their future. The Russian Emperor Paul I, who had been elected Grand Master by a group of knights in 1798 despite being married and Orthodox rather than Catholic, represented one possible path toward revival through integration with existing European power structures. Paul's vision emphasized the order's potential role as an instrument of Russian foreign policy in the Mediterranean, while his substantial financial resources could have provided the foundation for renewed military activities against Napoleon's expanding empire. However, the canonical irregularities surrounding Paul's election and his death in 1801 prevented this Russian solution from achieving lasting success. Pope Pius VII's refusal to recognize the Russian Grand Mastership reflected both theological concerns about Orthodox leadership of a Catholic institution and political calculations about the papacy's relationship with various European powers. The papal insistence on canonical regularity and Catholic orthodoxy, while maintaining institutional integrity, also eliminated the most promising source of immediate material support for the order's revival. The election of Giovanni Battista Tomasi as Grand Master in 1803 marked the beginning of a more traditional approach to institutional reconstruction based on papal protection and the gradual restoration of European properties. Tomasi, an Italian knight with extensive diplomatic experience, understood that the order's survival depended on adapting to the new political realities of post-revolutionary Europe, while maintaining sufficient continuity with their historical mission to justify continued existence. His strategy emphasized the charitable and medical aspects of Hospitaller tradition, while de-emphasizing the military functions that had become increasingly irrelevant in the age of national armies and modern warfare. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 provided the first significant opportunity for the order to secure international recognition of their continued existence and legitimate claims to their confiscated properties. The restoration of traditional monarchies throughout Europe created a political environment more favourable to institutions like the Hospitallers, while the general desire to restore stability and legitimacy encouraged support for historical continuity over revolutionary innovation. However, The practical results of these diplomatic efforts proved disappointing, as the major powers were reluctant to disturb existing property arrangements or create complications in their relationships with the governments that had benefited from the confiscation of ecclesiastical holdings. The limited territorial compensation that the order received through the Vienna settlement included the Duchy of Pontecorvo in the Papal States, which provided a modest territorial base and source of revenue but could not support the kind of sovereign military activities that had characterized their historical operations. The duchy's small size and landlocked position made it unsuitable for naval operations, while its limited resources could support only a minimal administrative structure and ceremonial court. Nevertheless, this territorial foothold provided legal continuity and enabled the order to maintain diplomatic relationships with European governments that might prove valuable for future expansion. The gradual evolution of the order's mission during the 19th century reflected both practical necessities and changing European attitudes toward charity and medical care. The Industrial Revolution had created new forms of poverty and social dislocation that traditional charitable institutions were poorly equipped to address, while advances in medical knowledge offered opportunities for more effective treatment of diseases and injuries. The Hospitaller's historical expertise in medical care positioned them to contribute meaningfully to these emerging social needs, even without the military capabilities that had once defined their primary mission. The establishment of the order's headquarters in Rome in 1834, following the loss of Pontecorvo, marked a decisive shift toward purely charitable activities under direct papal protection. Pope Gregory XVI's recognition of the order as the sovereign military order of Malta provided canonical legitimacy and protection from secular interference, while acknowledging their transformation from a territorial military organization to an international charitable institution. This papal protection proved crucial during the political upheavals of the 19th century, when nationalist movements and liberal governments throughout Europe continued to challenge traditional privileges and ecclesiastical institutions. The development of modern medical facilities under Hospitaller auspices demonstrated their ability to adapt medieval charitable traditions to contemporary scientific knowledge and social needs. The hospitals that the order established in Rome and other Italian cities incorporated the latest advances in surgical techniques, pharmaceutical preparations, and disease treatment, while maintaining the traditional emphasis on providing care regardless of patients' ability to pay. These institutions attracted skilled physicians and medical researchers who valued the order's international connections and financial resources, creating centres of medical excellence that enhanced their reputation throughout Europe. The outbreak of the Crimean War in 1854 provided the first significant opportunity for the order to demonstrate their continued relevance in an age of modern warfare. While they could no longer field military forces comparable to national armies, their medical expertise and international status enabled them to provide humanitarian services that transcended the political divisions separating the combatant powers. Hospitaller medical personnel served with the various armies during the conflict, treating wounded soldiers and developing new techniques for managing the massive casualties produced by modern weapons and military tactics. The experience gained during the Crimean conflict influenced the order's approach to subsequent European wars and established patterns of humanitarian service that would characterize their activities for the remainder of the 19th century. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871 saw extensive Hospitaller involvement in treating casualties from both armies, while their facilities in Rome provided care for refugees and civilians displaced by the fighting. These activities, while modest in scale compared to their medieval military operations, demonstrated genuine social value and attracted support from European governments and private donors who appreciated their non-partisan approach to humanitarian assistance. The unification of Italy posed particular challenges for the order's position in Rome, as the new Italian state's relationship with the papacy remained contentious and the status of ecclesiastical institutions uncertain. The Law of Guarantees in 1871 provided some protection for papal institutions, but the Hospitaler's international character and historical claims to sovereignty created potential complications that required careful diplomatic management. The Order's adaptation to these circumstances involved emphasizing their charitable mission while maintaining sufficient ceremonial dignity to preserve their historical identity and international relationships. The development of the long system during the 19th century reflected both continuity with historical traditions and adaptation to contemporary European nationalism. The national associations that emerged in various countries provided frameworks for organising charitable activities and recruiting new members while maintaining connections to the central organisation in Rome. These associations enabled the Order to develop local expertise and resources while preserving the international character that had historically distinguished them from purely national institutions. The expansion of Hospitaller activities into new geographical areas during the late 19th century demonstrated their ability to adapt their mission to global, rather than merely European or Mediterranean contexts. The establishment of associations in the Americas, including the United States and several Latin American countries, reflected both the migration of European Catholic populations and the Order's recognition that their future growth lay in adapting to the demographic and economic changes reshaping the modern world. These new associations brought fresh perspectives and resources, while maintaining connection to the historical traditions that provided institutional continuity. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 presented the Order with their most significant opportunity to demonstrate social relevance since the loss of Malta. The unprecedented scale and destructiveness of modern warfare created humanitarian needs that exceeded the capacity of existing institutions, while the international character of the conflict required neutral organisations that could operate across political boundaries. Grandmaster Galazzo von Thun und Hohenstein mobilised the Order's resources to provide medical care, refugee assistance, and prisoner of war services that earn recognition from all the major combatant powers. The medical services that the Order provided during World War I incorporated both their traditional emphasis on treating the sick and wounded and their adaptation to the specific challenges posed by modern military technology. The massive casualties produced by machine guns, artillery, and chemical weapons required new approaches to battlefield medicine and long-term rehabilitation that stretched existing medical knowledge and institutional resources. Hospitaller physicians and nurses worked in field hospitals, evacuation centres, and rehabilitation facilities throughout Europe, developing expertise in trauma surgery, prosthetics, and psychological treatment that would influence medical practice for decades. The Order's prisoner of war services during World War I reflected their historical role as intermediaries between Christian and Muslim powers, adapted to the circumstances of modern international conflict. Hospitaller representatives visited prison camps, facilitated communication between prisoners and their families, and provided medical care and supplies that supplemented official military provisions. These activities, conducted under the protection of their neutral status and international recognition, demonstrated practical value that transcended religious or national divisions, while maintaining connection to their historical mission. The interwar period witnessed significant expansion of the Order's charitable activities and institutional development as European governments and private donors recognised the value of their humanitarian services. The establishment of new hospitals, medical research facilities, and educational institutions provided concrete demonstrations of social contribution while creating sustainable sources of revenue and institutional purpose. The Order's medical schools and nursing programs trained professionals who carried Hospitaller traditions into secular medical practice, extending their influence beyond their own institutional boundaries. The rise of totalitarian movements in Europe during the 1930s created new challenges for an international religious organisation that depended on maintaining relationships with diverse political systems. The Nazi regime's hostility toward independent religious institutions and international organisations posed particular threats to the Order's German association, while similar pressures emerged in other countries where authoritarian governments sought to control or eliminate autonomous institutions. The Order's response to these challenges required careful balance between maintaining their charitable mission and avoiding political confrontations that could jeopardise their members' safety. World War II provided the most severe test of the Order's ability to maintain their humanitarian mission under extreme political and military pressures. Grandmaster Ludovico Chigi Albani della Rovere coordinated extensive relief operations that provided medical care, food distribution, and refugee assistance throughout war-torn Europe while maintaining the neutrality that enabled them to operate across battle lines. The Order's hospitals in Rome treated casualties from all combatant armies, while their international network facilitated communication and assistance for prisoners of war and displaced civilians. The post-war reconstruction of Europe created new opportunities for the Order to demonstrate their social value and expand their charitable activities. The massive displacement of populations, destruction of medical facilities, and breakdown of social services throughout much of Europe required humanitarian responses that exceeded the capacity of national governments and traditional relief organisations. The Order's international network, accumulated expertise, and neutral status positioned them to make significant contributions to reconstruction efforts while establishing foundations for continued growth and development. The development of modern diplomatic relationships during the second half of the 20th century reflected the Order's successful adaptation to contemporary international law and practice. The establishment of formal diplomatic relations with over 100 countries provided recognition of their sovereignty and facilitated their humanitarian activities while maintaining continuity with their historical status as an independent international entity. These relationships, based on mutual interest rather than military alliance or territorial control, demonstrated new models for how traditional institutions could maintain relevance in the modern world. The expansion of hospitaller medical activities into developing countries during the latter half of the 20th century represented both continuation of their historical mission and adaptation to global rather than merely European contexts. The establishment of hospitals, clinics, and medical training programs in Africa, Asia, and Latin America provided healthcare services in regions where such facilities were desperately needed, while creating opportunities for the Orders to contribute to international development efforts. These programs, often conducted in partnership with national governments and international organisations, demonstrated practical approaches to addressing global health challenges while maintaining the Order's traditional emphasis on serving the poor and vulnerable. The Order's response to natural disasters and humanitarian crises during the late 20th and early 21st centuries has demonstrated their continued ability to mobilise resources quickly and effectively for emergency relief operations. Their involvement in disaster response efforts ranging from earthquakes and floods to refugee crises and epidemic diseases has provided concrete demonstrations of social value while maintaining connection to their historical role as providers of medical care and assistance to those in need. These activities, conducted through their international network of associations and partner organisations, have enabled them to respond rapidly to emerging crises while leveraging resources from multiple sources. The contemporary structure of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta reflects both historical continuity and adaptation to modern organisational requirements. The Grand Master, elected for life by the Council Complete of State, maintains ceremonial and administrative authority over the Order's global activities while working within constitutional frameworks that balance traditional prerogatives with contemporary governance practices. The various national associations operate with considerable autonomy while maintaining connection to central coordination and shared mission objectives, creating a federal structure that can adapt to local conditions while preserving institutional unity. The Order's current membership of approximately 13,500 knights, dames and chaplains represents a diverse international community united by shared commitment to charitable service, rather than military obligations or noble ancestry. While the traditional emphasis on Catholic faith and charitable dedication continues, the modern order has eliminated many of the exclusive requirements that historically limited membership to European nobility. This democratization of membership has enabled expansion into new geographical areas and social contexts, while maintaining the high standards of personal commitment and service that have historically characterized Hospitaller identity. The medical and charitable activities that define the contemporary order's mission operate through a global network of hospitals, clinics, and social service programs that serve millions of patients and beneficiaries annually. These facilities, located in over 120 countries, provide healthcare services that range from basic primary care to sophisticated surgical procedures and medical research. The Order's emphasis on serving populations that lack access to adequate medical care continues their historical mission while addressing contemporary global health challenges. The diplomatic status that the Order maintains with over 110 countries provides unique opportunities for humanitarian diplomacy and international cooperation that transcend traditional political boundaries. Their neutral status and historical reputation enable them to facilitate dialogue and cooperation between governments and international organizations while providing humanitarian services in conflict zones and politically sensitive areas. This diplomatic role, while different from their historical military functions, maintains their relevance as an international actor capable of contributing to peace and stability. The preservation of the Order's historical legacy through museums, archives, and educational programs ensures that their remarkable thousand-year history continues to inform and inspire contemporary activities. The documentation and study of their evolution, from a modest pilgrim hospice to a sovereign international organization, provides valuable insights into institutional adaptation, cultural continuity, and the enduring human capacity for service to others. Their story demonstrates how institutions rooted in medieval religious traditions can maintain relevance and social value while adapting to radically changed circumstances. As the Sovereign Military Order of Malta approaches its second millennium of continuous existence, it stands as a unique testament to institutional resilience and adaptive capacity. From Brother Gerard's humble hospice in 11th century Jerusalem to a global humanitarian organisation serving millions in the 21st century, the Order has demonstrated remarkable ability to maintain its essential mission of serving the sick and poor while adapting to changing political, social, and technological circumstances. Their transformation from crusading knights to modern humanitarian workers illustrates both the continuity of human needs and the possibility of institutional evolution that preserves core values while embracing necessary change. The Order's contemporary mission continues to reflect the fundamental principles that Gerard established nearly 1,000 years ago: service to those in need, regardless of their background or circumstances, provided with dignity, compassion, and the highest possible standards of care. While the specific forms of this service have evolved from medieval pilgrim care to modern global health programs, the underlying commitment to human dignity and charitable service remains constant. In an age of rapid change and global challenges, the Knights Hospitallers example demonstrates that institutions grounded in enduring values can maintain relevance and social contribution across centuries of transformation, continuing to serve humanity's most fundamental needs while adapting to ever-changing circumstances. Their nearly 1,000-year journey from the narrow streets of medieval Jerusalem to the global community of the 21st century stands as one of history's most remarkable examples of institutional continuity, adaptation, and enduring service to human welfare.